Okay. Okay, here we are. I'm going to pull the chat aside just so I can monitor it a little bit as we go along. And yes, thank you for pointing that out, Steve. I do need you to answer those poll questions if you would like the 3.5 hours of credit for this class. Please answer all of the questions if you plan on asking for credit. So presenter mode. Okay. So yes, this is a basic course for beginners. So I plan this out for people that are new to floodplain management, or if you are someone who works closely with floodplain management, maybe in your department. I also see that we have some seasoned floodplain managers. Sometimes people like to use this to brush up on the basics, which is fine as well. And so a lot of this is based on our quick guide, which is a basic desk reference that we put out a couple years ago. And so there's slightly outdated information as far as insurance and risk rating 2.0, but I will be covering some of those changes today. And so if you'd like a copy of our quick guide and you don't have one, it's on our website, or I'd be happy to send it to you. And I will point out which of those pages should not be used anymore as far as insurance. So these are some of the discussion topics that we'll be covering today. So I'm going to start with a little history and background on the National Flood Insurance Program, why we regulate floodplains, and then I'm going to walk through how to calculate a base flood elevation. We will cover permitting, accessory buildings, technical FEMA forms, special flood hazard areas. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about just construction in the floodplain in general. And so hopefully that gives you a feel for the next couple hours. Okay, so the National Flood Insurance Act was passed in 1968. So that is the start of the National Flood Insurance Program. And so this is what made subsidized, federally subsidized flood insurance available to communities that agree to participate. So it's a voluntary program. And so you have an agreement with the federal government to regulate your floodplains and control that land use. And so prior to 1968, all we had was disaster relief. We had these special disaster loans that were available to people. And so that wasn't a sustainable program. We have to put something back into the system. And so at that time, the Housing and Urban Development Department was the one administering the program. And then afterwards, they moved it to FEMA to administer the NFIP. So we are under FEMA now currently. And so after this time, in the early 1970s, in 1972, Hurricane Agnes on the East Coast really caused a lot of devastation to thousands and thousands of homes, and there were casualties. And only a few structures at that time had taken advantage of the federally subsidized flood insurance. So most of the homes that were damaged were not insured. And so this costs a lot of money, of course, for disaster assistance. And so after Hurricane Agnes, they passed a law for there to be a mandatory purchase requirement if you have a federally backed mortgage and you're in the special flood hazard area. And so we still have this law today. So the average FEMA individual assistance payout is $5,000 and the average flood insurance claim is about $30,000. So I just wanted to talk about Hurricane Agnes really quick. So the hurricane came up on the west side of Cuba. It came up through Florida. That's where it made landfall. And then it passed through our southeastern states. And then it went back out into the ocean and made landfall again up north into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so between the second landfall, it damaged 43,000 homes or so. I think only 13 or so were insured. So this is between $2 and $3 billion of damage and between 117 and 128 fatalities. And I believe that range is due to whether you account some of the spin-off tornadoes and other things that happened because of this hurricane system. So the devastation here is what encouraged them to pass this law for the mandatory purchase requirements. And so Again, this is a voluntary program where you regulate your floodplains and you follow the rules set out in the Code of Federal Regulations, and we make federally subsidized flood insurance available to the community, either voluntarily or under the mandatory purchase requirements. Again, that's if you have a federally backed mortgage in the special flood hazard area. And so there are conditions here. So we say voluntary, but if you don't participate and you have special flood hazard areas, then you can't get mortgage insurance there. You can't get federal grants or disaster assistance in those areas. It could lower the housing value in that community. So it's kind of voluntary with these conditions attached to it, which are often a very big incentives for a community to participate. So that's the background on the National Flood Insurance Program. And so here are some common acronyms that we use all the time, every day, and that I will probably be using for the rest of the presentation. So the base flood elevation is BFE, and so we use that all the time. That's our flood that we regulate to. The elevation certificate is a FEMA form that documents the elevation of a structure, and it's certified. And then the flood hazard boundary map is not one that you'll see much anymore. That's the older style map. We moved on to the FIRM, or the flood insurance rate map, which is what we use now. It's the regulatory map that shows us where the special flood hazard areas are and where we conduct floodplain management. And then the flood insurance study is a very detailed report that goes with your flood insurance rate map and your other regulatory products. It tells you all about the data that was used to create the map, and we'll be taking a closer look at that in a little bit when we calculate a base flood elevation. The DFIRM is a digital firm. So we have lots of communities in Kansas that now have digital firms. We are working on digitizing everyone's map, but that will take some time. And then FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency that administers the NFIP. And the NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program. And then Special Flood Hazard Area, SFHA, is another one that we use pretty frequently. So the base flood and the base flood elevation. So again, this is the flood that we regulate to. It's a compromise that we make between greater and lesser floods that can happen. So this is also called the 1% annual chance flood and the regulatory flood. And we try to avoid using 100-year flood. So it is another term that's interchangeable with these other terms, but it can be misleading for people who think it's something that only happens once in 100 years. I have heard it described that way. And of course, we know that's not correct. We're describing a probability. It's a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded each year. And so we have to think of probability because every flood is a gamble. We don't know when things are going to happen exactly, and we're having more erratic and unpredictable and extreme weather patterns, and we're looking at an increase in flood waters and rainwater. So again, it is a compromise between having completely unregulated development happening in the floodplain and restricting any development at all. So we allow development as long as it meets our performance standards. And so it's better to use the term regulatory flood or 1% annual chance flood, because that really describes what we're talking about. You know, it's like you put your hand in the marble jar and you have so much probability of pulling out a certain color. Same thing, except we could have, 5 100-year floods in a year. We could have 10. It doesn't change the probability. And so since we're talking about floodplains, we should talk about the anatomy of a floodplain. So here we are, we're basically standing in a stream channel with a glass cutaway so we can look inside the stream channel. So there's a stream channel in the middle, and then we have the adjacent areas to that, and we call that the floodway. So this is where the fastest velocity is the most water, and so the floodway is the stream channel and those directly adjacent areas that are necessary to convey the floodwaters. So what we do is we have higher restrictions for development in the floodway. We want to avoid having development in there at all. And often our higher standards for those types of development are often a deterrent for people to not build in the floodway. And then we have the flood fringe, which is the rest of the floodplain and the various other flood zones that we have. And so we'll take a look at the different types of zones. And so you have the floodway and the fringe together making the 100-year floodplain or the special flood hazard area. So here we have the special flood hazard area, and now we've started adding development, which we could also call encroachment. So as we fill in the space where this water used to be, we're putting in development in this area, we're putting in fill and houses and whatever other construction, we're starting to displace that water. So water can't be there anymore. And because of that, we're squeezing it into the stream channel and we're causing a rise in the floodwater. So that's where you see in the water, the surcharge area. So that's the water that's been displaced by our development. And so, base flood elevations would change with encroachments, and that's why we have such standards for having that not happen. We don't want to see a surcharge, and we keep it to within 1 foot. We don't like more than 1 foot of rise, but of course, 1 foot of water could mean a foot of water in your house. So in Kansas, we do have the 1 foot of freeboard requirement for everyone. So all residential structures have to be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and non-residential could be elevated or dry flood proofed. So that's the requirement. And if you look at the bottom of this slide, it talks about development in the floodway. So the higher restriction that I was talking about is having a no rise certification. So you have to pay for an engineering study that will determine for sure that there's not going to be any increase in flooding for that development. And so that extra study can be very expensive, and any change or anything else you do in the floodway would also have to be certified. And so that's how people are deterred from making any kind of development or change to the floodway, which is good because we would really want to just keep that area open. So why do we regulate the floodplain? So we have to protect people and property. So the words health, safety, and general welfare are in all of our planning documents. It's in our ordinances, and it's a compromise for allowing people to make those developments. And so we make sure that federal flood insurance is available. Like I said before, before we had the National Flood Insurance Program, all we had was the disaster relief assistance. And so that wasn't sustainable. And we need to make people a little bit more responsible for their developments in the floodplain. We can't just come to their rescue every time and pay to get all of that fixed. So that's why we have the mandatory purchase requirements. And to save those tax dollars, again, that we were losing out on just disaster assistance by itself, and to avoid liability and lawsuits. So we can't just let people do whatever they want in the floodplain knowing that there's a hazard, and we don't warn them about it, and we don't keep them safe and protect them from the flood within reason. So we have to do that. And if you decide to withdraw from the National Flood Insurance Program, then there's a chance that your governing body could be held liable at some point for not protecting people in the face of having the scientific data that says there is a flood hazard. And of course, to reduce flood losses in Kansas. So that's why we have a 1 foot of freeboard requirement to try to keep people's houses and other structures and investments from succumbing to flood damage. We also have to think about the first responders that have to come and rescue people in floods. So we did at one time have a flood where teenagers decided to go whitewater rafting in the floodwater, which is not a smart thing to do. We've lost volunteer firemen in this same incident. So he was swept under the water and ended up getting caught up on the line and drowning. So when people don't want to comply with floodplain management regulations, they're really not thinking about the danger to themselves or future property owners of that structure or the first responders that might have to come rescue them because they're in a situation where they're being flooded. It's much the same when people don't want to buy flood insurance because they don't have a loan, so they're not under the mandatory purchase requirement. So we've seen some pretty bad situations where people have completely lost everything because they didn't have flood insurance, and homeowners insurance doesn't usually cover flood damage. And also it's dangerous when people just drive into floodwaters. They don't realize that the road has been washed out and it only takes between 12 and 24 inches to float a passenger car. And so the number one reason for flood deaths in a flood is because of people getting trapped in their vehicles. And so it's pretty serious. We have to think of this thing of these individuals and the danger that they are presented with, especially first responders who are risking their lives to help others. If you want to hear the gravity of this, there are some 911 calls on YouTube of people being trapped in their vehicles. So it is a very real danger and a concern. And we have to do our due diligence to protect people. And so since we are talking about our floodplains and our regulatory documents, we should look at our flood insurance rate maps. So again, this map tells us where our floodplains are and where we are enforcing these regulations. So what type of map is it? You can see at the top is labeled as a firm. The older maps, the flood hazard boundary maps, are labeled as such as well. The community name is in the center. So this says City of Solomon. It also tells you what county it's in, and it gives you the county number as well. So the community number is there just across from the community name. And then the panel of the map, so the map and panel number together are towards the bottom in bold. So 20041, and then C is for county-wide, 0061, and then following that is another C, and that is for the number of revisions. So this has been revised 3 times, and that's what that letter tells you. So don't be fooled by the top portion of the title block where it says panel 61 of 220. That is an abbreviation. So when your permit or you're looking at an elevation certificate and it asks for the map and panel number, then that's the full number that you're looking for towards the bottom. And then this has a little site diagram on it. So it has a little block shaded out that tells you where this particular panel fits in with the entire county-wide product. And then, so yes, revision. And then the effective date, December 16th, 1988 is the effective date. So a lot of this information, again, is going to come up on the elevation certificate or other types of certificates that you might look at, floodproofing certificates. And of course, it should be on your permit form for sure. So we can find these on the FEMA Map Service Center. So I will show you how to find that and how we can make a firmet, which is a zoomed in smaller copy of the firm panel so that we can look at our areas of interest. But first, let's look at the different flood zones that we have in our floodplains. And so this is one style of flood insurance rate map. This is the older paper style. This is what they look at, or sorry, this is what they look like when you pull them up on the FEMA Map Service Center. And so our digitized maps look similar to this, but they have a little bit more detail with an aerial photograph and some different color codes. So I'll show you that. But first, the base flood elevation is here. It's on the map, so you can see them along the squiggly lines. So those are rounded off base flood elevations as well as with the cross sections. So those are the straight lines that have the hexagons with the letter inside them. Those are the cross sections that have detailed numbers, but they're not here on the firm. There's not enough room for them to be on the firm and still be legible. So we have to go to the flood insurance study to actually look at those and find the exact number or calculate a base flood elevation for a specific area within a flood zone that has base flood elevations. So if you are reviewing a certificate or you're filling out a permit and you get an application and it has a number like this on the firm, from the firm, then you need to send it back or recalculate and get with that person, because these are rounded and we have to have them to within 1/10 of an inch. So we'll take a closer look at that in a little bit. Otherwise, we have zone AO. So it has a blue arrow pointing to that. So zone AO is a shallow flooding area. So it doesn't have a base flood elevation. It has flood depth. So it's a little bit different. And the way we regulate it's a little bit different. But we are trying to phase those out as much as possible. They have kind of created some issues here and there. And then zone AE. So this is a zone A with a base flood elevation. So we are able to calculate a base flood elevation in these areas. And then shaded zone X. So that is pointed out. It's on the right side of this map. And so the shaded zone X is the 500-year floodplain. So it's a 0.2% annual chance flood. And so this is actually considered moderate risk area. It's not part of the regulatory floodplain unless you adopt it into your ordinance that you do regulate this area. Otherwise, it's advisory that this is a moderate flood risk area. And then the rest of the land areas that are outside of the floodplain are called zone X. And so these are unshaded zone X areas. And so they're considered to be outside of the floodplain and they are low risk. So there's a difference between shaded zone X, 500-year floodplain, and zone X, unshaded, low risk, okay? And then the floodway, of course, we have talked about that. So you can see the stream channel inside the floodway, and it's inside of those horizontal lines, or sorry, those diagonal lines. So it's a diagonal crosshatching. And so this is how it will look on all the maps that you look at, whether it's in a different color or not. The floodway has this crosshatching so that you know where it is, and that's where we have to have the no right certificate for any development in them. And again, you can see the stream channel inside them because it's the stream channel and the directly adjacent areas that transfer floodwaters. So here is a DFIRM as it will look on the FEMA Map Service Center when we pull that up, and I will show it to you. So you can see this, instead of a drawing, it has an aerial photo background, and then the actual floodplain looks a little bit different. So it's inside the blue lines, and then it has blue stippling inside of it. And then the floodway again is there. It has the diagonal crosshatching, but it's in white instead of black this time. But you can see it inside of the floodplain. So the unshaded zone X has nothing on it. It's just part of the aerial background. And then zone A, which we haven't talked about. So that is an approximate floodplain. It doesn't have base flood elevations already calculated for you. We will go over some methods to find the base flood elevation for those areas, because we do still have to have a base flood elevation for those areas for permitting. And then the zone AE, there it is again, and you can see the cross sections there. So cross section A with the detailed numbers that are available in the flood insurance study. There's the floodway with the cross hatching. You can see the rounded off base flood elevations again, and the shaded zone X this time is in black. So it's in a black outline with black stippling. And again, that's not part of the regulatory floodplain. So you can see where that is and how it's outside of the actual regulatory floodplain. And then yeah, the cross sections look pretty much the same on this one. So not a whole lot of difference between the two different versions. So this one does look quite a bit different. This is the National Flood Hazard Layer. So this is FEMA's GIS service, basically with the digitized flood maps. So you can pull these up on the FEMA Map Service Center, and it looks like the one that we just looked at like this, or you can pull it up on the GIS National Flood Hazard Layer website, and this is what it looks like. So a little bit of different color scheme. This color scheme is to help those with color blindness to see them a little bit easier. And so here we have the AE zone that's in this blue-green color. And then the floodway here is labeled and it's in the red and blue crosshatching. So still diagonal crosshatching, and you can see the streamline. Then the unshaded zone X again is just the blank aerial photographed areas that are outside of these boundaries. The 500-year floodplain or the moderate risk areas are in orange on this in this color scheme. And then if you look to the right side of this map, there's orange and black crosshatching. So that is an area that is protected from the base flood by a certified levee. And so we will talk more about levees and their certification a little bit later on. And you don't see it on this one, but in AO zones are also here, and I think they're like a lighter green color than this. So here's where we can find copies of our map. Again, you can go to the National Flood Hazard Layer if you have a digital map, or you can pull it up on here as well. So you can see that little snippet on the right of the National Flood Hazard Layer. And it's right next to the address search bar because that's what you'll get if you use the address search bar. So you can type in your address, and if you have that digitized map, it should be able to pull it right up and you can make a format really quick out of it. If you still have a paper map and you're not digitized yet, we'll use the search all products option, which is right underneath that. It's a little bit longer, slightly more tedious, and but it's not that bad. You should still be able to get the information that you need, and we are working diligently to get everyone digitized flood maps. So this is actually from last year in 2020, December. So this map is actually a little bit out of date. Our mapping experts have made quite a bit of progress since this time, and I'm helping some of these communities on here that are listed as in redevelopment to go ahead and get their maps adopted. So we are working hard to get that done. Okay, so here I have typed in my office address in Topeka, and since Topeka does have a digital map, I'm able to use the address search bar and just search for it, and then it pulls up my office building here on the National Flood Hazard Layer, so you can recognize that color scheme. And so it has a little red pin where my office is, and it has all the information that I could need on the map. My map and panel number and the effective date are there in green just underneath that. It tells me where Shawnee County boundaries are and where it intersects with the city of Topeka. So we're not actually in the floodplain, we're adjacent to it, but you can see the floodplain there and the floodway just adjacent to it and the aerial photo background. So if I like this, I can just hit dynamic map and it'll just generate this format for me from the National Flood Hazard Layer. So this is useful, it's quick, and it has everything I need. I have a little scale bar at the bottom and a representative fraction and a north arrow. And then I have my legend with all of the flood zones in it and where my area of interest is. So this is nice and it's useful. I can use this for anything I would use a format for. So that could support LOMA paperwork if I was going to do that. And I will spend some time talking more about LOMAs and what that means. But basically, I have a miniature version of the firm that's zoomed in on my area of interest so that I can take a closer look at it. So there's that. And if you, again, don't have the digital map just yet, then we will use the search all products option. So here we just hit search all products, and then it takes us to these drop-down menus. So we just hit state of Kansas, and then you pick out your county of interest, and then it will pull up on the last drop-down menu all the communities in that county that have a digital map. So if I was looking for areas outside the city limits, I could hit Shawnee County Unincorporated, and then I just enter that, and then it takes me here. And so here are all my effective products. I have 189 different effective products, so I need to narrow down what firm panel that I want to look at for my area of interest. So I hit effective products, and it shows me that out of 189, 95 of them are firm panels. So this is the whole county-wide product with all the firm panels for that county. And so, or for that community within the county. And so if I don't know what firm panel I'm looking for, because I still have paper maps, then I can use the index. So the first product listed here is 20177C, again for county-wide, and then IND is for index. And so this is a general map, like a highway map, that shows me all the different panels that I have to choose from. And so this one is for Lawrence. It's an older style map, but it's good because you can see all of these different landmarks that I could use to help narrow down where I'm looking for what panel that I need. And so you can see the city limits, you can see the Kansas River across the top. I have the Santa Fe Railroad going down diagonally. So that could help me pinpoint a location. There's also the area off to the right towards the top that has a long strip, and then a couple areas off to the left of it. That is our airport for Lawrence. It's actually outside of city limits, but it's part of the city. And so that's actually the runway and then the area for the airplane hangars. So someone told me they were building just northeast of the airport, then I could probably pick out that the firm panel that I'm looking for, is the 00890 over here. And so that's how I would do it. You can look at the firm panel and make sure it's the right one, or pick a different firm panel. So once I have the right panel, I can make the ferment out of it using this process. So you just hit create a ferment and then it will take you here. So first you select your page size. So you want to select the page size that you're going to use throughout, especially if you're going to print it out. If you print it out, you need to print it to the same size that you saved it so that you preserve the map scale and it doesn't get distorted. So you hit that and then you hit next and it says select print area. So now I can drag that green box on the map and drag it over my area of interest and then hit next, and the little grayed out box that's over the scale bar and the north arrow will turn green, and I can adjust that how I like it. Then I hit next and the box over the title block will turn green and I can adjust that, and then you hit preview the ferment. So here's a preview and I make sure that I like it and that I have what I need, and then I can just save it as a PDF or PNG file. So at the state, we try to use PDF. It's more versatile if you have to send it to different people. It tends to load better than a PNG file. So you click download it, and then you can just save this and file it away with your property files, with your permits and everything. You can keep it with your permits. That's a good idea. If you have something like a new subdivision area that's being built, you might want to be able to come back to this format. So it's nice to just keep a copy of it. So here's what it looks like. Again, we did look at this style earlier, so you can see everything here and where my office is and the aerial photo background. So yes, all right. So the flood insurance study. So I mentioned that this is a detailed report with all of the data that goes with your flood insurance map products and everything. So this tells you all about how they were made. It tells you about the different cross sections on all the different streams inside the county. And so that's what we're going to be looking at to calculate a base flood elevation in one of the areas that has a detailed study. So again, the approximate A zone doesn't have that. We'll have to use a different method to get that calculated by someone. But for these detailed areas, we can calculate them ourselves, and we should be doing that for any permit or elevation certificate that we review, and we want to just make sure that it's correct. Because you don't want to approve a permit for something that wasn't or won't be built in compliance, which is, again, at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So this is the flood profiles. So these are towards the end of the flood insurance study. So these are pages that look like graph paper, and they have all of the different streams for the county basically graphed out on graph paper. And so this will show you where the cross sections are for that stream. And so it's basically a graphical representation of the map. And so then you have your elevation in feet for the different flood frequencies. So you can see the legend on the top left here. It tells you what the different lines mean. So the solid line is the 500-year floodplain, and then the long line, and then the two short broken lines, and then the long line again. That pattern is the 100-year flood, and that's what we're going to be looking at because that's our base flood. So you want to find the right stream. So I have done this where I accidentally calculated for the wrong stream, and then I found out, the number was way off. So that's something to look out for. And then, yeah, you'll want to find your area where your property is and your upstream cross section. So I'm going to go through an example here of how this is done by building my fantasy dream home here in Lawrence. So this is 1205 Brook Street. And so I've put a red square where my building footprint is going to be. And then on the left side, you have a zoomed out view of this area. And I have a red dot where approximately the building is. So you can see that this is along Brook Street tributary. So that's the stream that I'm working with. And it's just downstream of, just upstream of the confluence with another tributary. And then it goes right into the Kansas River right there. So the direction of flow here is actually south to north as we're looking at it zoomed in on this particular property. And so I actually did this in GIS. If you have GIS software, we have through our Kansas State GIS service, you can pull in these services into ArcPro and be able to load and look at all of our regulatory floodplains using the GIS, which is really helpful. It's really fast and it's detailed. It might be easier than working with a Fermet even. Just watch out for your projection. There is a Kansas projection. So if you need more help, I could get you in touch with our mapping team. We also have a couple of videos of one of our mapping specialists going through this exact same calculation, and he talks a little bit more about the GIS files and everything. So, sorry, I didn't mention, if you look at my building footprint, I have two cross sections on the either side of it. Sorry. So you can see the upstream cross section is the one that's actually just south of my building. It's at 826.1. That is the exact base flood elevation for that particular cross section. It's not quite at my building. And then the downstream cross section is 825.4. So again, the upstream cross section is what we're going to be working with and looking at. And it's usually going to be the higher number. So that's why we work with, it will always be the higher number. That's why we work with the upstream cross section. We need to find the higher base flood elevation. And so here's the same site on the National Flood Hazard layer. I could use this as well if I wanted to with the Fermat, or I could just zoom in on in their GIS website and look at it and be able to see the cross sections. On our agriculture website under Division of Water Resources, we also have a state floodplain viewer. So that is also really easy to use, especially for us here in Kansas, because it's more Kansas specific. You can draw and measure in it. And that's really what we want to be able to do, whether in GIS or using one of the website services. So if I don't have a digital map, so for pretending that this is Lawrence with a paper map, I would go again through the search all products option, and then I would try to pinpoint, I'd make a Fermat of my area of interest, and then I would do my best to pinpoint this location as closely as I can using the scale bar and using some nearby landmarks that I can measure from. So if I have a paper map, I can go to Google Maps and I can pull up a map of my area, and then I can measure from a certain intersection and where it is from the street adjacent to me, and I can use those measurements to go back to my paper map and measure out exactly where my building footprint is. And specifically, we are looking for the upstream corner of my building footprint. That's what we're going to use. We need the distance between that corner of the property or the corner of that house and the distance to the upstream cross sections. That's what we're looking for, and that's how you would do it with a paper map. I do have a recording of me going through the paper map version from a couple months ago if you want to see that. So there I am, pinpointing my location as close as I possibly can. And again, preserve the scale. If you're printing it out, print it in the size that you saved it in. So as I mentioned, we're looking for the upstream corner of my house. So there it is. That's the bottom right corner. That's what it would be. And so we need to draw a line horizontally to where that upstream corner is parallel to the stream. And if you're using GIS, then you're looking at the stream profile baseline. So that's a specific part of the floodplain layers that you'd be using for this. Again, I do have a mapping expert going through this process recording if you need more help with this, or let me know if you need more help just measuring a base flood elevation for a certain location. I'd be happy to help you with that. Again, beware of the projection. You'd want to use a Kansas projection for this. So I've done my best to draw a line as perfectly and precisely as I can from that corner to the profile baseline where it's perpendicular. Sorry, not parallel, perpendicular. And so from that, I'm looking at where that line intersects with the profile baseline and the distance from that intersection to my upstream cross section, which is cross section C at 826.1. So where those two yellow lines are intersecting all the way up to my red line, that's the distance that I'm going to look at, and that's what I'm going to use to calculate my base flood elevation. So I'm in Arc Pro and I'm just using the distance measurement tool in here. Again, there is a tool in the state site, and I saw Steve put that in the chat. And also Google Maps can help you if you're doing it on paper. So when I measure this out, I get 21.1 feet. So basically 21 feet from the cross section. And so there is going to be possibly a little bit of variation as you're doing this between the different methods that we have between paper and the state website and Arc Pro. But it should be pretty close. It should be very close to what anybody, even a surveyor, would calculate for this, because we're all using the same method and the same data. So here is the flood insurance study and the flood profile towards the back of it for Brook Street tributary. You can see it is labeled there and it's in Douglas County, and I've got the correct stream pulled up. So one thing to notice is that the direction of flow is from right to left. So from the right is upstream, to the left is downstream. So it's a little bit counterintuitive when we want to read from right to left. And then that bottom line is my stream bed. And then, as I mentioned, the lines above that are the different flood frequencies that we'll be looking at. And so the red arrow is down there between B and C, and that's approximately where my property location is. So we're going to take a closer look at that so we can get that pinpointed. So, excuse me, what I've done is looking at the x-axis, so the horizontal line. The different profiles will have different scales, so you need to determine what the scale is, what that distance is. So typically these profiles are 10 by 10 squares. So there's 10 small squares across and going up. And so it's a distance of 1 inch on here. And it goes from 400 to 800 feet. And so I can figure out that interval to be able to determine how many squares I need to go down from cross section C to get to 21 feet. So each small square here is 40 feet. And so half of a small square would be 20 feet. So I'm going to do the best I can to measure 21 feet downstream from that cross section, because as you can see, it's not exactly on the line. It's a little bit downstream from that. So I've done my best with that red line that you see going vertically to get it 21 feet downstream. I've done my best. I also measured the distance between B and C cross sections just to check it with the real life GIS. And so it checks out with 0.4 inches equaling 160 feet in real life. So that checks out, and it makes me a little bit more comfortable that I've double checked my measurements and that I'm doing things correctly. It's just another one of those steps that you can check yourself on. As you're doing this, there's also another way to double check, and we'll look at that. But yeah, there's my red line. That's my property line. Again, I've done my best to be as precise as possible and get it 21 feet downstream. And so I've drawn that line up, and I just draw it all the way up through the profile, all the way up through the frequencies. And that way I can find where my upstream corner of my house intersects with the 100-year base flood. So I, again, have that long line with the two broken lines in the middle of it. And then I've taken that intersection and drawn a line horizontally across to the other side where the elevations are. So you would be doing this on paper map. If you have your paper flood insurance study as well, probably want to use a ruler to try to keep it as straight as possible. I'm doing it digitally, so I have these types of drawing tools in my PDF software, which is nice that you can get it all perfectly straight. Again, we're trying to be as precise as we can. Yeah, Steve likes to mention when you're doing this on paper, if your pencil's not that sharp, it could cause a little variation here. So again, precision as much as we can. So when I draw my horizontal line over, you can see the intervals between the squares here vertically are a little different. So I only have 5 feet between 825 and 830, and that's 10 squares. So 2 squares is 1 feet. And so I'm a little bit over the 826 line. So I'm gonna call it 826.1, which is the exact same base flood elevation that I have for my upstream cross section. But it makes sense that there's not going to be that much change if I'm only 20 feet downstream from it, and I'm quite a bit more distance from the downstream cross section. So I'm going to go with that. It's the safe number. I might be able to, I don't know, call it 826, but I am a little bit above that line. And we try to err on the side of caution and take the higher base flood elevation. So that's how I would do it. That's how I would calculate it. And you would make sure that it's lining up with your permitting information and the elevation certificate. Again, we don't want to see any rounded base flood elevations used for any kind of elevation documentation. Okay, so I did mention unnumbered A zones. They're approximate floodplains. They don't have base flood elevations, so we have to find another way of getting a base flood elevation to be able to permit any development in these areas. So one option is through our current effective floodplain viewer, and again, Steve put that link in the chat. So if you have a digitalized floodplain, and you can see which counties do have digital firms, they're outlined in green on this map. Sorry. So we have this available. And again, you can see the draw and measure tools, as I mentioned, for doing the base flood elevation. That can be helpful. And if you look even further down towards the bottom, it's in really small print on the left, but it says print. So if you click on that, it can help you make more of a state version of the ferment. And so what we've done is put the cross sections in the approximate A zones that were used to create the maps themselves. So it's not really regulatory data. We're using it as best available data because this data was good enough to create the maps. So this is available for a surveyor or an engineer that's working on a project to help them calculate a base flood elevation. So they can take this, they can make this ferment, and then they can attach it to paperwork and be able to explain how they use these cross sections to calculate a base flood elevation. And so what's important is on the bottom right corner is the disclaimer saying that this information came from us here at the state. And so whoever ends up reviewing it, maybe FEMA or yourself, you know where they got this information, this data. So that is for digitalized areas. This is really helpful. This is an area that I found in Lawrence that is an approximate area zone. Yeah, you may have noticed I'm partial to Lawrence. I'm a Lawrenceian. But anyways, the other option that we have here through the state is with our BFE portal. So this is a website that you can use where you just register for an account and you're able to log in. And if it's an area where we have base level engineering, which is actually quite a bit of the state at this point, we can send you information about the lowest adjacent grade for a building footprint or an area that you're working in. We send you information about the highest adjacent grade and the approximate base flood elevation as well for those areas. So it's not survey accurate. This is based on LiDAR, which is plus or minus a foot. So it would have to be worked with a little bit more or be well above the base flood elevation that's calculated, but this can help support finding a base flood elevation in those areas. And so we have a flyer if you want to see that has instructions on how to use it. So you try to draw a polygon as close as you can to the building footprint with the drawing tools in there, and it gives you information about that. So you can submit a request for a base flood elevation, or you can just go in there and look around at the map and click around and look at the LiDAR values to get a good idea. Maybe on a property that might want a LOMA, you can go and see if they're a good candidate for that based on the LiDAR. Again, it's plus or minus a foot of error. So tall grass even could be something that set it off, but we have used this to look at areas that were definitely well above a base flood elevation or something, just to look at the candidacy for something like a LOMA. So I will get to that in a few seconds, but one last look at flood zones here. So we've gone over A and AE. I talked about zone AO. So AO is sheet flow, and then AH is ponding. So it's a different type of shallow flooding. And we also have these areas, and they are pretty much regulated the same. They both have a depth number that they use instead of an actual base flood elevation. So we have that. And then zone AR is an area of special flood hazard that's in the result of a decertification from a flood protection system that's in the process of being restored. I don't think we have any of these in Kansas. So that would be like the area on the national flood hazard layer that I showed you that had the black and orange striping for the levee that's certified. And so this would be from a decertification of that. Now they're back in the special flood hazard area, so they have to work on getting that certification back. Zone B, C, and X. So we talked about shaded zone X, which is the 500-year floodplain, and the unshaded zone X, which are all the areas outside of the floodplain. Those are the new determinations. That's what we call them now. They used to be called B and C. So you might see that on an older map. So if you weren't sure, that's what it is. And then zone D is an area that has undetermined but possible flooding hazards. And so I don't think we have any of those in Kansas. Yeah, Steve has confirmed that we don't have either of those in Kansas. And of course, yes, that could change. So that is pretty much everything for flood zones. So I'll spend a little bit of time in our last couple minutes here of our first hour talking about letters of map change. So I have mentioned a few times already the LOMA. So this is a letter of map amendment. A LOMA is based on natural ground. So we haven't changed anything. We haven't done anything to the ground. It is naturally higher than the base flood elevation. And because of that, we have the option to get a survey done and then get a determination from FEMA that yes, our map is wrong in this area. or this house should not be in the floodplain. It should not be mapped in. And so that's why they're free. There's no fee to pay for a LOMA. The other letters of map change, there are fees associated with them for different reasons. So the letter of map revision is a LOMAR. So this is when we're altering the floodplain physically, we're changing it by development. And so because of that, we're changing the map. And so that's why we have to pay for the fee to get that type of letter. And so typically from what I've seen, the LOMARs are more of the bigger projects because these are actually really technical documents that have to be done. So there's an MT2 application for this type of letter, and it's very detailed. And so these are usually associated with bigger projects. I suppose there have been some to Steve. Anyways, so yeah, these are typically the bigger projects. And then I guess there have been some smaller residential projects that have been done with a LOMAR, but not quite as much. It's usually the LOMA and LOMAR F that we see for houses and subdivisions, that kind of thing. So the letter of map revision based on fill is the third letter. This is a LOMAR F. And so basically we're putting engineered fill into the floodplain. And again, we are changing the floodplain, we're changing the map. So we have to pay a fee and we have to fill out the MT1 application, which is less extensive than the LOMAR, but we can take out either a house on a fill pad or we can take out the entire fill pad. And yeah, so Steve says he's seen LOMARs on things like subdivisions or large highway bridge projects. So yeah, big projects, very extensive. And then the LOMAR F is a little bit less extensive. There's a lot of responsibility on you as the floodplain administrator to review that application and make sure that everything is correct and completely verified. So again, I did do a class on LOMA and LOMAR F later last month. So if you want to see a recording of that, if you're curious about those couple of letters, there's more information there. And then we have the physical map revision. So this is the LOMAR PMR. So usually just called PMR, physical map revision. So this is where at the request of a CEO of a community, they submit new data and then FEMA reviews all of that. And then one or more map panels get revised and republished. So that is definitely one of the bigger projects that could be done. That's not a residential person or an individual doing an application for that. And then we have the LOMA out as shown determination. So this is a different type of LOMA. So again, there's no fee associated with this. And I have a couple slides on that I will show you. But first, just a closer look at the difference between a LOMA and a LOMAR F. So again, a LOMA is based on natural ground. We're not changing anything. It's naturally above the base flood elevation. And so you can come out of the floodplain with this determination. So sometimes people get an elevation certificate and they see that their lowest adjacent grade is above the base flood elevation and they think they're automatically taken out, but that's not quite the way it works. We have to go through with this paperwork. And then again, the LOMAR F is where we're adding engineered fill to the floodplain and we're getting it out that way by elevating the fill pad higher than the base flood elevation. And so anytime you're putting fill in the floodplain, you definitely need to check with us at the state to get a determination that you don't need a state permit, or whether you do or don't need a state permit, because fill in the floodplain often does. And so here's the LOMA out as shown. So as it suggests, the building is actually outside the floodplain. So you can see in the red circle, property 3414 and 3412 are actually outside of the floodplain, but they have it in their backyard. So what happens is the bank, where they have their lender, is requiring flood insurance based on a flood zone determination that says that they are in the special flood hazard area. So the lenders often have a third-party flood zone determination company that makes this determination based on the fact that they're property line intersects with the floodplain. And so it's technically out, but they're saying that it's in. So this is something that a property owner could do on their own. You don't even need a survey to get this type of determination. You have a map from your GIS department, like this one. It's from CIS, or from the city of Lawrence. And so you fill out the first page of the MTEZ form, and then you copy the same documents that would be used for any regular LOMA, which is a copy of your deed, a fermet, and then a copy of the GIS map that I just showed you. And then you can get a LOMA out as shown determination. Again, that's free. And so yeah, you don't need an elevation, you don't need a survey, but you do need to make sure that your lender is requiring flood insurance based on the fact that you're in the floodplain, because they still can require flood insurance even if you're not. And then for levy accreditation, I did talk about this. There's a lot that goes into it. It's a feat of engineering, really. They can be overtopped, there can be seepage through them, there can be seepage underneath, erosion. So they have to have all of this maintenance and operations to make sure that it's stable and there's no erosion. So here is an example of one. And then in Coffeyville, they had a refinery that flooded, and then it's emptied a bunch of oil out into the water after their levee was overtopped. And that was in 2007, I believe. Okay. So that takes us to the end of our first hour, and I'm going to try and hurry up so we can get to our break. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, and then I'm going to launch our first poll question. So here's poll question 1. Oops. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you about a minute to answer this question. What year was the NFIP formed? We have 1965, 1968, 71, or 78. So again, if you want credit for the class, please go ahead and answer this question so that I can document that you were participating. Maybe another couple of seconds here. Okay, it looks like everyone who's participating went ahead and answered it, so I will end the poll and share the results. So yes, 1968 is the correct answer, so most everyone got that right. Good job. Now I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so when I left off, I had mentioned the 2007 flooding that happened in Coffeyville. And so, yeah, a glitch happened where they left a valve open and then everyone evacuated and they were flooded. And so about 100,000 gallons of oil went into the water and 400 homes were flooded all at once. And so if you can imagine that happening in your community, I think it was a 1 in 2,500 event. So they are working on mitigating their levee right now because they have had additional problems since then with the slides that I showed you before with the seepage and the sand boils. And so I was there over the summer talking about their mitigation. So that's a bit about levees, but about oil in general. Sometimes you will have a company that wants to drill in an area that's in the floodplain. And so they go and find the intent to drill permit. And so they do think that they have, they think that that's the only permit that they need, and they don't go and look for a state permit. And then they may not be aware about the floodplain being there and floodplain issues in general. So that may be something that's missed, and we do try to keep an eye on the floodplain as much as possible. I mean, you won't be able to catch everything, but if you act proactively and you reach out to companies that want to develop the floodplain to make sure that they are complying with regulations, that's the best way to go about it. So When Steve was a floodplain administrator, he had a company that did just that. And they were planning to develop in the floodplain. And so he ended up sending them a letter to let them know about the floodplain on the property. And so they were able to work together to get that permitted. And actually, they were able to find a way to stay out of the floodplain altogether. Yeah, for county, if you work in an unincorporated area, especially, this is something that might happen, that you might come across. So working with these companies, reaching out, letting them know about the floodplain and the regulations is important. Doing that legwork and being proactive is good because we don't, want any issues. So reach out to them before this happens. Oil, we don't want to see any oil in the floodplain or in the flood waters again. Because again, that caused a lot of damage for that refinery. They had to pay out for those houses that were flooded and covered in oil because there was no salvaging them. So yeah, we don't want this problem. We don't want to deal with it. So again, reach out in advance if you can. So this and other companies that want to develop your floodplain, sometimes you have utility companies. That one's really common. I did put out an article recently about transmission lines in the floodplain in our newsletter. So be proactive. A lot of times these companies will get contractors that do the permits for them. So utilities are pretty good about doing it. Pipeline and telecommunication type of companies have not been as good about it historically. So again, it's a good idea to try to keep an eye on your floodplain as much as you can. So here is a chain link fence that was in the floodway. So we hear a lot that chain link fences are fine anywhere in the floodplain because they let water flow through them. And this is what happens when water flows through them. They become clogged with debris. And so, yes, this was in the floodway. And and this is the only part of this fence that's still standing. And so it does end up causing an obstruction. And so that's why we need a no rise for anything that goes into the floodway. And so if people can avoid building in the floodplain, then that's preferable. It's part of our wise use of the floodplain and keeping development out of it as much as possible, and also planning ahead on community development and where that's headed, what direction with your floodplain layout. So again, we do need permits for fences. Fences is something that comes up really often. Anything, even a fence in the floodway, is going to need a no rise certificate. And so getting these smaller permits for something like a fence makes it easier to get bigger permits. So people are more likely to come to you to get a bigger permit for a bigger project if you're doing this consistently. I'm sorry. So we need to have consistent enforcement throughout the floodplains, and it's part of our responsibility. So I will spend a little bit of time talking about community responsibilities. And so people often want to build without a permit. And that we find this a lot in our audits. Some people have no idea that they needed a floodplain development permit. So getting the word out there in your community and doing outreach about the need for permits and floodplain restrictions and just flood hazard information in general is a very good idea. Some people do this on purpose, and they'd rather do it until they get caught and then ask for forgiveness later on. And so that often causes problems. So we still have to enforce violations as soon as we become aware of them. When we find out about them, then we have to go ahead with our enforcement procedures. So a lot of this we find out through neighbor complaints. So neighbors start squabbling back and forth, or we find someone did a development in the floodplain and then they start talking about how their neighbor did all of this other stuff in the floodplain and they didn't need a permit. So then we have to go ahead and get through all of that enforcement. So that's pretty common. And I did do violations class as well last month. So we have recordings of that. So we adopt an ordinance, and then we're requiring floodplain developments for any developments in the floodplain, which means any man-made change. And then we have to review all of the applications to make sure that they are reasonably safe from flooding. So we have had city clerks that operate as the floodplain administrator, and then they would just approve permits without reviewing them. So a couple of houses got built too low. So we definitely have to carefully review the permits that we receive and make sure that residential structures are 1 foot above the base flood elevation or higher if you have a higher freeboard standard. So that is another thing. You can adopt higher standards in your ordinances, and we encourage you to do so. They make your community safer. So non-residential buildings have to be elevated or dry floodproofed. And I will talk a little bit about dry floodproofing later on and how that works. And so another important thing that we should be doing when we review permits is to go and do field inspections. So if you can only do one inspection while a house is being built, it should be right after the foundation has been poured and put in. That way you can verify that it's at the right elevation, maybe have the surveyor out there with you to help verify that, and make sure that it's going to be built in compliance when it's finished, because that's the best time to correct a problem is before it's finished and the foundation can still be altered. So we have to require elevation certificates for compliance. We don't need them for flood insurance anymore necessarily. That's optional, and I will talk about that a little bit. So there's a little bit of divergence there between insurance and floodplain management. We have to carefully consider requests for variances. So I also have a section on variances coming up. And so variances should be pretty rare, really rare. There's specific criteria that has to be met, and I will talk about that, but we want to make sure that our review boards are familiar with that criteria and what has to be met, and that they can't just grant variances for anything, because I have had a floodplain administrator tell me that their board would just approve anything, and that's definitely a problem. FEMA is definitely going to notice that and have questions, and you could be audited at any time. So we need to watch out for that. And then resolving violations. I have a little bit about that, but yes, following our enforcement procedures, which means notifying the property owner and then working with them to get that fixed. And then we also have a responsibility to work with FEMA on map updates. So our mapping team does a great job of continuously reaching out to all of our stakeholders that are involved in a map update process. And so communities have plenty of opportunities throughout that process to voice any concerns and provide information about their community and the flooding. So there's several meetings throughout that whole process, and it's quite a long process. One other thing that you can do to help avoid violations is to require an elevation certificate that's under construction, so that you can verify before it's built that it's going to be in compliance. It's just one other tool that we have to help avoid violations. So again, I mentioned development is any man-made change. So that would include tool sheds, new driveway slabs that are even at the same grade. Even that's going to need a permit, and permits for that and a lot of things that are small like this are easy permits to do. So something like that wouldn't really need an elevation certificate. It's a driveway slab. And so there are sometimes things that we don't think of, or that property owners don't think of, like storage of materials. So I come across that quite a bit when I'm auditing communities, that there's often agricultural type of equipment that's stored in the floodplain. And so we do have regulations for that and how they have to be properly anchored, or we have to move them out of the floodplain. Bridges, culverts, temporary structures is another thing that people often think don't need permits because they're only going to be there for a few months or weeks, but they still need permits. And the tiny houses. So the the tiny house trend that got really popular not too long ago. Those also need permits. So pretty much anything that happens is going to need a permit, even maintenance on a roof. That should technically require a permit, and we do have the ability to exempt small projects from needing a permit. So that is something that we could put in our administrative procedures. We could create a memo or something like that that says maintenance of a roof doesn't need a floodplain development permit as long as it's maintenance and we're not upgrading the roof or doing like a full change of roof. If it's just a maintenance issue, then we can waive the permit. RVs also have restrictions, so I do have a section on that a little bit later. So again, unnumbered A zones, we have to have a base flood elevation for anything that goes into those areas as well. And so that means we have to have a base flood elevation calculated, and we talked about that a little bit. If we're in the floodway, then we have to have a no rise certification. It says there's going to be no rise in any of the flood levels, and that's certified by an engineer. Again, that often serves as a deterrent to keep people out of the floodway and from developing in it because the rules are very strict. We have to verify that everything is built with flood damage resistant materials. So we have to keep track of all this development that's going on in the floodplain because it does come up in our audits, and we do 6 audits on communities per year, and we are looking to increase that number quite a bit in the coming years. So when a permit is for maintenance, like I mentioned, roof maintenance, or maybe the replacement of a driveway slab, you can notate that on your permit that it was for maintenance, and that's helpful to know. And if it's something that's being replaced or maintained in the floodway, and it's the same size as before, then you don't have to require a new no rise, again, as long as it's the same and it's just a maintenance or replacement of the same thing. But either way, having this documentation can help. Again, I mentioned you'll be dealing with neighbors that complain about each other. And so having the documentation for their floodplain development can help quell some of that complaints or anger. People saying that their development's going to flood them in the floodway, push water onto them. Having a no rise certificate to show them can be like, well, we have this engineering study that certifies that that's not going to happen. So it's another one of our tools that we have, and then some key permit review steps. So Steve has been providing links in the chat. There is also a recording of me going through how to do a floodplain development permit if you want to see a longer session on just permitting. So we need to determine if we're in the floodplain or the floodway, and we've talked about the differences. If we're not in the floodplain, then we don't need to worry about it. We have to verify that other state and federal permits have been obtained. So that is written into our ordinance, and I will talk a little bit more about that. But one of those things is checking for a state permit, DWR, like I said, fill in the floodplain, or really dredging or excavating, or any type of project like that is something that could require a state permit. So you want to check with us. So there's a contact number in there. Is the site reasonably safe from flooding? So this is another thing that's written into our ordinances. And so, for example, if you do have fill going into the floodplain, if the top of the fill pad is higher or 1 foot higher than the base flood elevation, then that is reasonably safe from flooding. If they put in a fill pad and then tell you they're going to dig a basement down and into it, then that's not reasonably safe from flooding because it's going to be vulnerable to the subsurface waters, which is also something that's written into our ordinances. So that's why we have to carefully review plans before we approve any development. Does it show the base flood elevation? We need to know what the base flood elevation is in a detailed study area or an approximate area. The ground contours, that's something good to know. Is substantial improvements of an older building proposed, or any building? So I will talk a little bit more about determining substantial improvement and how it goes hand in hand with substantial damage. That also has to be assessed, whether in a disaster or an individual damage event to a structure. Is an addition going in? Because if it is, then again, we have to determine whether that's a substantial improvement. Will the new buildings and utilities be elevated? So I do have a couple of slides also about utilities and how they have to be elevated. Yes, they do. So we have to make sure of that. And that's also something that's going to be on the elevation certificate in manufactured homes. I'll talk more about that, but they do have to be properly elevated, just like any other residential structure, 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and anchored, and an appropriate and safe foundation. Crawl spaces are safe, elevated on piers, posts, or columns is safe. Fill is safe usually if it's in an area that we can do that, but a basement's not going to be safe and that's not permitted. So no, that wouldn't be an appropriate foundation. And have they agreed to submit an elevation certificate? Again, we have to require that finished elevation certificates are signed and sealed by a licensed professional, meaning an engineer or a land surveyor, to be able to verify that this has been built in compliance. So we want to look out for some of these red flags, like incomplete information. We're going to have to get back with the property owner to verify this missing information and get that filled out. I did talk about base flood elevations rounded off to the foot. And so usually if you see that, you can go to the firm panel and look at where they got that rounded off base flood elevation, and let them know that we need an actual calculation and it has to be within 1/10 of a foot, and use the upstream cross section, not the downstream cross section, because if you use the downstream, it's going to be a lower number and it could be below the actual base flood elevation. So that's why we go through with the whole calculation. It can be time consuming, but so definitely would be in a violation that occurred if a house was built too low or something. And then again, call DWR for fill that's going in. So that's why we have them fill out that information on our permit application. So yeah, Steve has mentioned that I do have a permit form. I have a sample or a template floodplain development permit application. So I can send that to you if you want a copy of it. You can compare it to yours and see if there's anything else you might want to add to it. Documentation of the Endangered Species Act. So this is something that's come up more importantly over the last several years after FEMA started getting sued for the Endangered Species Act. So I will cover that in a little bit more detail as we go on. But that's going to be definitely more important for a Lomar F specifically, but yes, we need to check on the Endangered Species Act. So our permitting responsibilities. So really be thorough with your ordinance. You should know all of it. So yeah, Steve put that address for our Manhattan field office for the Endangered Species Act for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. So I will talk about that, but that information, their address, email, and phone number are good to have for verifying that. And so we need to be able to understand and explain the federal, state, and local regulations to property owners, particularly when they're upset that you are requiring them to do something. Why do I have to do this? And then you can explain it a little bit better. So getting the word out there. So here's a sign that says home permits are needed. It'd be nice to have floodplain permits are needed somewhere written down. Before I got into floodplain management, before I started at DWR, I was really pretty ignorant to floodplains and requirements. I had never even heard of floodplain development permits before I started here. So as a regular citizen, I didn't know. So whatever you can do to get that information out there to citizens, having it on the website and other, community center, having brochures out there, whatever you can do. Outreach projects are creditable under the community rating system program. So I will cover that towards the end of our class, but That, and of course, correcting violations. So we have an enforcement process that we go through to notify property owners about a violation and then getting that resolved. So we have that, and then we have this process permit applications where we get an application, we review it, and then there's an inter-office review process. So I'll talk about that more in a second. So that may mean having other people look at it because there's technical data that you might not be familiar with in your background, site plans, the topographic data, the elevation certificates. So we have to evaluate that, what they plan to do, collect the fees, and then follow up and get any missing information. And then we have to approve or deny the permit. And we deny it based on some type of non-compliance issue. And then ensure that these projects are built according to the permits, according to the plans that they submitted. And so that's why I suggested the inspections during construction. So if you can do one, ideally 3 inspections, 1 after the site's been staked out, 2 after the foundation has been put in so we can verify that elevation, and then 3 when we're near completion so that we can look at other features that we need, such as flood openings, to make sure that a crawl space is compliant or something. And then maintain these records in perpetuity. Absolutely, definitely want to have permit files or property files with all of their permits in there filed away neatly. You don't want to just leave them laying around in a cardboard box somewhere. We had an issue where someone, the floodplain administrator was on vacation, and then someone in the office just threw it away because they were cleaning things out and no one knew what it was. So then all of their floodplain documents were thrown out, and that's definitely not going to be good if you're audited. Yeah, you don't want to end up in that situation. So I'm sure everyone here who's taking a class doesn't have an issue like that, but file away hard copies, and then definitely follow the college rule of having 3 different locations of electronic copies, maybe to the cloud, to a thumb drive, and then maybe a different cloud service or your machine, whatever you want to use, but definitely having backups of it and scan in all of the hard copies of stuff. And then you have copies of your map and that data, like your flood insurance study, available in your office and for the public to use at City Hall or wherever. And then you want to update these forms as we go along. And of course, updating your ordinance. Let me know if you want to update your ordinance or if you have any questions about updating your ordinance. I'm the ordinance guy here. So any changes, I'm here for that. And so I did talk about this inter-office review process. So again, someone building in the floodplain could have other permits that they might need for zoning or electrical building, other departments that need to look at these site plans. So there should be a process for this and the routing of where an application goes after someone has reviewed it. So having that routing through the office. The sign-off procedure, once it has all the signatures that it needs. And so everyone should know what their role is in reviewing an application, why they're reviewing it, as it pertains to their particular department and their role, and how the procedures go, who they need to send it to afterwards. And then you might want to just have an all-out meeting with the applicant. It could be helpful to have a meeting with them and then make sure that they know the other permits that they might have to apply for depending on their project. And then we do also have to notify DWR and FEMA of any alteration or relocation of a water course. So that's probably a bigger project. But yeah, I've mentioned in the last slide, these preliminary steps. If an applicant contacts you to get an application, it's an opportunity to talk to them about their project and what they're going to need. You might have a formal meeting with them or just this phone call, or send them a follow-up email, whatever, just to get them all of that information possibly, and that could maybe help avoid delays in having a full and complete application to review or making mistakes as far as what's required for floodplain development. And then you can explain the inspection process. I'm going to need to come onto your property and do a couple of inspections. It's written into our permitting process that I can do this so I can verify compliance. And we can't review an incomplete application. So again, we would have to contact them, but having this pre-contact might avoid us having to do that. So hopefully we can develop this open communication and have a good working relationship with them to have this go as smoothly as possible. So we want to have this done in a timely manner. So we may need to have some kind of turnaround time. Like I'll have your application either approved or denied within this specific time frame. So I did mention the Endangered Species Act and that FEMA is in a lot of litigation right now over this specific law. So what happened is that FEMA was, approving letters of map change and that kind of thing without verifying this. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services started suing them in different areas of the country for harm and damage to these endangered species. And so FEMA basically is still tied up in court. Anything in litigation is going to take a long time. And so this has been delaying them getting out new guidance to us on the ESA that they have been promising for quite some time. So we've been lacking that. And so it was basically that they were violating the ESA and executive orders. So they're kind of agreeing that it is FEMA's fault. And so we were promised new guidance 3 years ago and we haven't gotten anything yet. So now FEMA has passed on that responsibility to the communities. And so now we have this requirement for community officials to be verifying that the ESA has been complied with. And so we then as communities should be passing that on to our applicants. So Steve did give us that address and that phone number. So they're holding you responsible now for verifying that and not issuing us new guidance on how to do that. So I'll talk a little bit about how we can do that. Steve gave us that information. That's for the Manhattan field office, Kansas ES at fws.gov. So you just tell the applicant to send an email to that address, or email is probably best, and have a description of the project and have a map, maybe have a format, a couple maps, make sure that they understand exactly what's going on, and then they can issue a determination to them on whether or not any endangered species might be harmed by that. And so that's the official way to do it. That documentation should serve for the purpose of having the ESA verified. And again, that's going to come up really importantly and specifically if you're doing a LOMAR F, so the letter of map revision based on fill. If you're doing that, then you have to sign the community form, which is part of the MT1 application that specifically states that you verified that they are complying with the ESA. So that's important because you're kind of on the line for having that. So definitely get this documentation from the applicant. Again, you shouldn't have to do it, make them do it, get that from them, and then keep it on your file, keep it with the permit, keep it with all of your other documentation. So I will show you a website on the next slide. It's called IPAC, which is the information for planning and consultation. So I'll show you that, but basically it's just a website where you can do what I described in the email, where you describe the project and you have pictures and you can draw a polygon of the exact building footprints in there. And it's a free website, and then it'll come back, it'll generate a letter with what kind of animals could potentially be harmed by that particular project. And so Steve did one of these where he signed up and then did a fictitious project on his land in an area that was a hay meadow. And so he got a letter back talking about 3 different species that could potentially be harmed by this fictitious project. And so it was a fish, a mussel, and a bat. And so since I mentioned it was a hay meadow, there was no trees for the bats to roost in, and that would be the habitat that they would be interested in. And there was no type of creek or water source for a fish or a mussel to be in that area either. And so he could print that letter out, and that could serve as documentation to verify the ESA. We've been told different things about whether or not the IPAC letters will be accepted or not. We've heard yes from someone that it was, and we've heard no from someone else that it wasn't. So you have the official way, you have this other option that could work. Again, we're waiting on specific guidance from FEMA after all of this litigation has been settled. And so we can really only tell you what we've been told. So here's the IPAC website. Again, it's just, you're free. It's free. You just you register for it, log in, and you can see it's a US Fish and Wildlife Services website. So it really does seem like it should be accepted. But yeah, it's free, so why not just sign up for it? Okay, the other option. So I did mention that I can't guarantee that these last 2 methods are going to work, but it should work, and it should serve as some kind of protection for you that yes, you did make an effort to verify this with the applicant. So this is the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks website. They have an ecological services page on their website that talks about threatened and endangered species. And so they have this listed out by county so that you can look at the types of habitats that you might be looking at. And what's good about this is that it also lists state species. So it has state and federal species. Some species might be more plentiful in other areas, but they're endangered or threatened in Kansas. So it's actually more thorough than the other 2 methods. And so this is a quick look at what might be in your area, in this your area of interest where your development's going in. Another good thing about checking with us at the state for state permits in the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks is that we have this environmental inter-review process. Sorry, the exact term's escaping me, but it's an agreement between the state agencies that we're going to check with each other between 6 different agencies to make sure that this particular development does not need a permit. Yes, the Environmental Coordination Act. Thank you, Steve. And there is talk of doing away with this act, which would be unfortunate because then we have to have the applicant look at all of this themselves, and they're going to have to verify all of these permits. And so I think it's a lot more likely that permits could be missed, or that we're going to have to ask for and require more documentation that they've checked with these agencies. So that could be something that's coming in the future. And again, can't guarantee you that these other 2 methods are going to work for FEMA. It might get rejected, but the Manhattan field office option with their email address should work. It should be the official documentation that would be accepted. Okay. So yes, FEMA is being sued over the ESA, and that is holding up guidance. That's the problem. Okay, just want to make that clear. And so again, we want to maintain these records permanently because this is what we ask for when we do audits. I want to see all of your documentation for the last 3 years. And I'm also going to be looking at your floodplain through aerial imagery to look for change in your floodplain. And I'm going to try to pinpoint as close as I can approximately when that development happened. Based on Google Earth and other imagery services that I can find. So I may end up going a little bit over 3 years when I do this, when we ask you for an audit, but it should be okay because you should have documentation for it anyways. So yeah, These are all the different records that you're going to want to keep and that we're going to ask to look at, which are your regular permits, variances granted. We'll also ask for variances requested in those determinations, your floodway encroachment, your no-rise certificates, any water course alteration, floodproofing certificates, basement floodproofing certificates if you're part of that program, engineered flood openings. We need the certification to go with those finished elevation certificates, your substantial improvement and substantial damage determination. So that is definitely something that should be on your floodplain development permit, and it is on the template that I could send you if you want to see that. And then your finished elevation certificates. We don't actually look at your letters of map change. We can find those ourselves online and on our state website, but that and any applicable state or federal permits. So we have that, and then we have all of the sites that I look at when I am going through that imagery. So we could do audits. FEMA might do an audit. Really, you can be audited at any time. And so, like I said, we are looking to increase the number of audits that we get done per year quite dramatically in the coming years. So that could be you. That's okay. People are really apprehensive about getting audited, but I don't really think it's that scary. I mean, we're here to help you find solutions to problems, and we're going to help you get things resolved and get moving on any violations that may have occurred. I definitely expect to see at least maybe one development that wasn't permitted or something. It can be hard to see. Some of this is on private property, so we're not even able to go there and verify it, and neither would you be able to unless someone specifically told you, and then you'd have to go through the enforcement procedures of getting permission to go on someone's property. So, this does happen, and there's no reason to be afraid of a floodplain audit. It's just part of the program. And so another thing I wanted to talk about is the terms that we use. So I went over the acronyms in the beginning, and some other terms that we use when we talk about construction are very specific. We mean specific things. And so when you are meeting with the property owner or discussing a violation with them, it's important to describe the terms that you're using, because there can be misunderstandings. I've had misunderstandings even with floodplain administrators, what exactly I mean. So now I try to over explain things. I don't want to make anyone feel dumb or anything. I just want to make it very clear exactly what I mean and what I'm talking about, because we have seen violations that happen just as a result of people misunderstanding. So lowest floor, when we say that, and this is part of the elevation certificate. So flood insurance has changed. The elevation certificate for now has not changed, and it's still going to be going all the way through November of next year, or next year. So lowest floor is the lowest enclosed area, including a basement, whether finished or unfinished. And so it needs to be built in compliance. And so we did have someone, the floodplain administrator told them the lowest floor and the top of the bottom floor that we're looking at has to be above the base flood elevation. So they ended up building a basement and then saying that the ceiling of the basement was the top of the bottom floor. And so it's actually the floor of the basement, and then that is already out of compliance. So they ended up having to fill in that basement. And so it was just a complete misunderstanding on what that term actually means. And so I just wanted to point out that first floor height for insurance, I mentioned this, is the height of the building's first lowest floor above the adjacent grade. And that's what we're looking at for insurance now. It has changed. We did look at the lowest floor. So that's one of those new things under risk grading 2.0. And so as far as I can remember from our stories, we had 2 houses that were built wrong in Kansas because of this type of miscommunication. So again, you might be think you're communicating well, but people might misinterpret you, and they're not familiar with a lot of words that we use all the time. So it might be a good idea to pass out some information about the NFIP. So FEMA has plenty of publications that can make this more clear to a property owner if they have questions. Questions about the NFIP is a particular one. So again, insurance has changed. So some of these publications are a little bit out of date now with their insurance information. And I'm hoping that FEMA will provide us with more of the types of publications that we use all the time like this, but with updated risk rating 2.0 information. So aside from having information about the legacy system, about insurance that's not as accurate anymore, I'm hoping that that's going to get updated. So I did just talk about community assistance visits. So this is what we call the CAV, or that's what it's short for. That's the audit. So again, permits and everything, all of your documentation for the last 3 years, and then whatever I can find in the aerial imagery. Yes, yes, everyone wants risk rating 2.0 information. It's really, it's just not coming out as fast as, you know, the actual policies are coming out. So we are in between the two phases. We're in just after phase 1 on October 1st. And so all the existing policies that haven't renewed yet are going to be transferred over to risk rating 2.0 on April 1st. And so we'll have some more information at least about risk rating 2.0 from that happening, at least. Doesn't mean we'll have new guidance. So this, the audit is also something that is required to join the community rating system program. So I will talk about that a little bit later, but you have 6 months after your CAV is closed to apply. So that's a really great opportunity for communities to do more for their floodplains and get discounts on their flood insurance. So I will mention that. And so we always have several of these open that we're consistently working on, and we have more that we start every couple of months. So this is an ongoing process for us. We're always working on these audits and working with floodplain administrators to get their communities in compliance. Again, we're trying to find solutions and help you fix problems and help you to hopefully prevent any future damage, and also educate citizens and staff about you know, the NFIP and compliance. I also mentioned that we try to plan out our community development as much as possible. Having a plan for the future, if you have a lot of development going on in your floodplain, is, you know, really important, because, you know, the water displacement and all the encroachment that we talked about. So working with all your departments to plan out this growth and have a comprehensive plan for it, because, you know, we don't want to make flooding problems worse, and we're looking at more extreme weather, and possibly, you know, they're going to get worse on their own anyway, so we don't need to contribute to that. So working with the flood zones and floodplains to help guide that growth. Some communities don't have this issue. Some communities don't have much development going on in their floodplains, and, you know, that's okay too. Just if it is, we want to do what we can to have safe use of the floodplain. So here we have a subdivision that can go into the floodplain a couple of different ways. So the top two are the recommended type of development, where we have the subdivision and we're keeping it out of the floodplain. We're doing what we can to keep it out, even though these buildings would be flooded with even a slightly larger flood. It's still best to try to keep it out if we can. Try to keep that encroachment away from the floodplain. So the bottom one, we have larger lots where the top two buildings go into the floodplain and the other ones are not. But the top two, none of the houses are actually in. And so these are the types of houses that might want to get a LOMA out as shown, because they're technically out, but they are definitely intersecting those property lines with the floodplain. And of course, nature doesn't read maps. People, you know, behind a certified levee, and people that are outside of the floodplain get this sense of security that they're not going to flood, that they're safe from flooding. They're not necessarily safe from any flood. There's always some kind of flood risk. Larger floods can and will continue to happen. So again, houses with basements are not a good idea, even just outside of the floodplain, because of this fact that you're very close to the floodplain. So any larger flood could cause damage to your basement, even though it's a legal development outside of that area. So there's a 26% chance that a home in the special flood hazard area would flood during a 30-year mortgage period. And so the chance that a major fire will occur in the same period is only 9%. And then berms with flood walls. So these types of development can help keep flood damage away from a house, even though it's not the type of development that is, certified. It's not going to help you with your flood insurance, but it is worth the investment if you want to protect your house. So here we have an earthen berm, and then we have a concrete flood wall that we call a knee wall. It's about knee high. You can also put in backflow valves. So this kind of construction should be encouraged on people who make improvements that are not substantial improvements, that don't have to bring their structures into compliance, but we can say, these are some other options that you can do to keep your investment safe. And since you're investing more in your structure, you should do what you can to keep it safe. And so that's something to encourage. So here's an example of a berm in front of a house. So it is not creditable. And this house actually filed for a Lomar F and said that the house was on top of that fill that's there, even though it wasn't. And then FEMA actually approved that Lomar F. And then they found out later on that this was a mistake. And then they were afraid to go back and reject it after they had already accepted it. And so nothing actually happened with that, but the principle of keeping your home safe is still valid. And then variances. So we have very specific requirements for variances. We have to have good and sufficient cause. And then unique site conditions. So we're talking about the land, not the property owners. We're not talking about economic hardship only as far as it goes as for land use. And so if you're in the floodway, we still can't have an increase in flood levels. We still need a no rise. So flood insurance can be very expensive, and we need to look at the property, not the person. So I wanted to show you this. This is from FEMA 480. And so this is a very basic floodplain management publication for floodplain managers. So we have to have good and sufficient cause. And here are some excuses that are not good. The property value, inconvenience, money issues, or handicaps, if it's going to look different or something, or again, costing too much. Hardship is for the property, not the person. So we have to look at that, and we have to make sure that our boards understand this, that review the variances requests. And of course, if we do give them one, we should send them some flood equipment, which is a joke, but also it is very serious, and people are going to be in danger. And again, thinking about the first responders as well. And so after this, we have what is the elevation certificate and how is it used? So we have our elevation certificate. So I have talked about this a little bit. And so these have to be signed and sealed by a licensed surveyor or an engineer. So the instructions do say that an architect can sign them, but not in Kansas. It's a state by state rule. And so architects can do floodproofing, but they can't do elevation certificates. So that's something to keep in mind. Engineers can do either one. So they are used to show that sites are on natural ground above the base flood elevation. So that is in reference to the LOMA. So again, I mentioned that people sometimes get an elevation certificate and they see that their lowest adjacent grade is higher than the base flood elevation, and they think erroneously that they are automatically out of the floodplain. So it's important that they know that they actually need the LOMA paperwork to be filed and go through with the survey and have it approved by FEMA to officially come out of the floodplain legally. And so it's also used to verify that buildings are elevated properly. So this is the finished elevation certificate, or if you're requiring the under construction elevation certificates, then that's what that would be. And then it's also used for insurance. So this is now optional. I think I mentioned this, but anyways, for flood insurance, it used to be you had to have a signed and sealed elevation certificate to apply for a policy. That's no longer true. We now have the option of submitting one. FEMA and risk rating 2.0, they now have an algorithm, a whole risk rating engine. And so it takes in all of the different variables that they're going to use to determine, they're going to use that to determine the first floor height and your elevation relative to the flooding source and your type of flooding source and all of the other variables that go into it. And so they also have the core logic first floor height tool that they can use to determine what that height is. Again, that's your first floor that's above the adjacent grade that they use now for rating. And if that doesn't work, then they can make assumptions about your first floor height based on the type of foundation that you have. And so if you don't like those numbers that they come out with, then you have the option of getting an elevation certificate and submitting that for the policy. You can also self-certify it in any zone now. So it used to be just for AO zones in Kansas because the A zone, we do require the base flood elevation. The AO zone, again, is depth. And so people could just fill it out for that. And so this is only for insurance. We don't take those for compliance, but they can, we take it for compliance in an AO zone. But if we're talking about certifying any other structure in a different zone, then it would have to be a surveyor or an engineer. For insurance, they can fill out the G and F section where they can self-certify it, and then FEMA could possibly use that elevation certificate for their first floor height and maybe get them a better number for their premium. So that is a change that has happened starting in October. So here's just a little snippet of an elevation certificate. This is section C, which is actually the elevation information. I do have 3 classes that I did last month on the elevation certificate that have been recorded. So if you'd like to see that, it's on the website. And so we also have a video of Steve doing a demonstration where we have a model house. And then he has ways of adjusting it so that we can look at the different types of foundations and where this information goes. And I will be showing you the different diagrams in a couple of minutes. And so, so here we have a drawing, and again, this is from our quick guide, where the base flood elevation is coming up to the yard. It does go into their attached garage, which is a bit lower than their actual house living structure. So that's okay. You can see that the attached garage is wet flood proofed. It's got a little flood opening right there, and the utilities are also elevated to keep them safe and keep them compliant. And so it's possible that they could get a LOMA because their actual living structure, the actual slab on grade house is higher up, and then the attached garage is lower. It's in the floodplain, but it's wet flood proofed, which is allowed. So that could work. Or if they're on an artificial hill, which actually this diagram does say compacted fill on their yard. So that would be a Lomar F, where they've put in a fill pad and then they built on top of that high enough to get out of the floodplain. So there are 9 different diagrams on the elevation certificate. That is for section A, number A7, that's where we put our diagram. It's the #1 mistake that we see when we review elevation certificates is people getting the diagram wrong. It can be kind of tricky, so we have to look at the different features of the structure to get that right, but really it depends on the type of foundation. So it says the slab on grade house was elevated on 1 foot of fill above the base flood elevation, and then the vented garage is 2.5 feet below the base flood elevation. So it used to be under the legacy system of flood insurance that if you had your elevation or had your utilities left on the ground, if we just put them on the floor of the garage where it's wet flood proof, where they could get wet, that could potentially change your entire rating floor for flood insurance down to that attached garage, and that would be a significant increase in your premium. Under risk rating 2.0, that's not the case anymore. No one is going to be penalized for not elevating their utilities, even though it's a compliance issue. So that has been taken away. That's another kind of split up between floodplain management and insurance that we don't have backing us up as much anymore. We do kind of have a backup in that they will get a discount, a 5% discount if they elevate their utilities high enough based on the kind of structure that they have. So I do have a slide that we'll go over looking at that, but so yeah. Here are some of the diagrams. So we'll look at the first couple. So again, I mentioned there are 9, and so 1 and 2 have 2 different types in their category. So diagram 1 is slab on grade. So that's the house we were just looking at. It's a slab on grade. There's no other type of foundation on it. It's just a poured foundation on top of the ground. And so they can have higher stories. They can have more than 1 story, but the bottom of the floor is basically just on the ground, and that's why it's called slab on grade. So C2A, that's the top of the bottom floor. You can see where that is, and then C2B is the next higher floor. That would be above that, and then C2F through H is going to depend on the actual site conditions that they have. And then diagram 1B is in a raised slab on grade. So here you have foundation stem walls coming out of the ground, and then you put fill inside of that like a concrete box, and then you pour a slab over top of that, and then you have this raised slab on grade feature. And so C2A would be that top of that slab, C2B, again, the next higher floor. And this is mostly for non-residential structures that we have this type of construction in Kansas. And then C2A and C2B are our true basements. They are below ground on all 4 sides. So again, this is not compliant in the floodplain unless you are part of the basement exemption program, and then there are specific standards for those basements as well. But so 2A is the true basement. It's just a basement below ground. Then you have your next higher floor, and again, C2A, top of the bottom floor, is the top of the basement floor. 2B is a walkout basement or a patio basement. So you have that basement, you see doors there. Top of the bottom floor is the basement floor. And then you walk out, you're kind of in this sunken patio area with a retaining wall. And then there are stairs to come out. And so that would be your lowest adjacent grade. Your lowest adjacent grade would be right up above that, but yep. And then, so you can have these diagrams out in the field to help you if you're doing an inspection, or if you happen to be filling out an elevation certificate, if that's what you do as a surveyor and an engineer. So these can be handy and helpful either way, reviewing or filling it out. And then, so we have diagram 3. So this is a split level. And then, so you have a split level with a basement next to that. So split level slab on grade, and then 4 is a split level with a basement, and then 5 is elevated without an enclosure. It's on piers or posts. It's a very safe type of construction. And then diagram 6 is with an enclosure. And so partial enclosure, you just have to be able to use it as an enclosure, which means parking, storage, or building access. Same thing with diagram 7. It's a full story enclosure. It's wet flood proofed, and it only has those specific uses, no habitation. And then diagram 8 and 9 are both crawl spaces, and we've talked a bit about crawl spaces and we'll continue to talk about them, but you have elevated on a wet flood-proofed crawl space, next higher floor above that. So C2A is at the bottom of the crawl space, and then diagram 9 is a subgrade crawl space, and there are specific conditions for that. We don't see them very often, but so they have under risk grading 2.0 combined some of these. So you have slab on grade, which is 1A, 1B, and 3. The basement is 2A, 2B, and 4. And then 5, 6, and 7 are the same as they were for the elevation certificate. And then they have combined crawl spaces into just one category. So this is from the quick guide. We used to have these rating tables that would tell you what your premium looked like based on how high above or below you were from the base flood elevation. But that isn't valid anymore because we have risk grading 2.0, and this tells you everything about what's driving your rate, which is again replacement costs, past claims values, the FEMA mapping data, but also other governmental sources from different agencies, catastrophe modeling, your distance to the flood source, what the flood frequencies are, what kind of flooding source it is, and so. We can't tell anyone what their premium is going to look like. All we can say is there's no substitute for elevation. Elevation is the best way to go. And and so elevation will help you lower your premium. We just can't tell you by how much. And again, an elevation certificate has to be by a licensed land surveyor or professional engineer. And we have to have the no rise certificate for any development in the special flood hazard area. So this is where this would be signed and sealed that any development in the floodway is not going to cause a rise in flood levels. So that's important. Okay. Oh, sorry, I went over just a couple minutes again. So we're gonna exit and let me pull this up so I can get to our next poll question. I gotta stop sharing my screen. Okay, poll questions. Next question, launch. Here we go. What flood zone is of minimal flood risk? We have unshaded zone X, shaded zone X, the AO zone, or the AE zone. Again, I need this to be able to give you credit for your CEUs today. I will give you a couple more seconds to hopefully get that answered if you are seeking credit today. Looks like there are 5 or so people that haven't answered yet. Okay. Looks like 3 more people. I'll give you like another 20 seconds or so to be able to earn that credit. Okay, let's just end the poll and share the results. Yes, the minimal flood zone is the unshaded zone X. So most people got that right. Good job. And I'm going to pause our recording and go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we will continue to talk a little bit more about floodplain construction, and I know we have spent a bit of time on the crawl space, but it's one of our more important type of foundations. They're common in cities, less so than fill. So this diagram has fill and crawl space on it. So fill is not common because of the more densely compacted cities. People might actually get water redirected onto them. So fill is more common in rural areas, unincorporated, where there's a lot more space for water to be redirected to, that it's not directly onto someone else. So the crawl space, again, we have to have openings in the walls to be able to let water flow in and out to equalize pressure on the foundation walls. Otherwise, it is very possible for those walls to collapse, and that is going to be a major structural damage event for that structure. So that's what we want to avoid, and why we have the flood opening requirements. And so then we have service equipment, our utilities, electrical circuits, all of that above the base flood elevation. Here it's on our lowest floor, which again in Kansas is 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And then over on the right side, we have fill. So it's just a slab on grade, but it's above the base flood elevation on our compacted engineered fill. And we have that service equipment also elevated. It's on the lowest floor, which is above the base flood elevation. And again, if we want to get out of the floodplain on this particular building, then we take it out with a Lomar F for either the structure or the fill pad. And so a little bit more about engineered fill. These are basic guidelines that are in our quick guide, but there are more really specific guidelines on how the engineering needs to work for this to be compliant. So we have earth and fill that doesn't erode or slump when the water rises. The whole point of this is to protect the structure with the fill by keeping it out of the floodplain. So we have to meet these requirements, and so it should have graded side slopes that are not steeper than a 1 to 1.5 ratio. So that is a 1 foot of vertical rise per 1.5 feet of horizontal extent. So that's the slope that we're looking for. And protecting that slope with vegetation that can keep the water from eroding it for low velocities, and then having really durable materials for a high velocity. And those flood velocities are determined by the design professional. And then it's machine compacted to 95% of the maximum density, which is again determined by a design professional. And we're looking for good, clean soil that doesn't have large rocks in it or any other kind of debris or woody material. And so again, this goes back to the engineering and our state permitting requirements so those permits are reviewed by engineers to make sure that the fill is compliant and everything. Because we don't want the fill pad to be destroyed in a flood. So here is a building that was constructed on a fill pad. So it's clearly a gravelly fill pad that's not natural grade. I think I mentioned that, no, I haven't. If a fill pad was put in the floodplain before that area was mapped into the special flood hazard area, then we can actually count it as natural grade. And it's actually eligible for a LOMA in that case if we are able to prove that date. So it might feel like you're lying, but it's actually legal. It's written into the Code of Federal Regulations that we may consider that older fill pad to be natural grade. So in this case, this building was built, and the fill pad was built just a couple of months before there was a flood. And so this building was fine during the flood, and then a nearby grocery store ended up with 4 feet of water inside. And so after that event, they went ahead and elevated themselves on fill as well. And then they put cement over it instead of gravel, and it looks a little bit more smooth than this. But yeah, fill can make things worse. So we have talked about this a bit about displacement of water. So you have a house that's elevated on the left side, and so it looks like it's definitely above the base flood elevation, and then other people start to move in. They've added fill to the floodplain, and now they've displaced water, and it looks like everyone is flooded after that. So that's where that surcharge comes in. And it happens with construction and just actual engineered fill that's going into the ground. And so fill displaces the water, and also putting in those types of impervious surfaces that go with construction and development, like cement, causes more runoff where water cannot soak into the ground as it would before. So that is a problem. And again, why we don't usually put fill in densely populated areas. And we have spent a bit of time talking about basements. Not allowed in the floodplain, again, unless you're part of the a residential basement exemption program. And so that is a specific thing where a community is individually approved to participate in that program. And again, we only have 10 of those communities. So for everyone else, the basement is not allowed. And by FEMA definition, again, that means the floor is subgrade on all sides. And so that's what makes it a basement. We've seen where people have accidentally turned a crawl space into a basement by putting fill in around that. And then the interior grade is below the actual exterior grade outside. So that can happen as well, something to watch out for. And so on the left side, we have a house that is flooding through the basement window. So we have heard people try to argue that a window would keep the water out, but it is not uncommon for them to break, and then you have water going into the structure that way. And then on the right side, we have another basement. So this one doesn't appear to have a window or window wells, but you have a basement infill, and then you have water seeping into the ground as it does, gets absorbed, becomes saturated. And so the hydrostatic pressure is still getting to it through this wet soil. So that pressure is increasing linearly with depth. And so it's just pushing in on those empty basement walls. So there's nothing on the other side to push back. There's nothing to equalize the pressure like we do have with flood openings. And so it's not uncommon to see a situation like this where the walls just bend in and break, the floors as well, because you have that buoyancy force underneath, and that's why we have the arrows pushing up. So the floor can just collapse, the walls can collapse, and that's why we don't have basements in the floodplain, because the foundation walls collapse. And again, collapsed foundation walls is a major damage event for that structure. So Steve had this sketchier construction job when he was younger, where things were done a little bit under the table without permits, but there were basements where this would happen. And so the walls would collapse or the floor would crack open, and then you might have soil and water coming in that way. So they would have to lift the house out of the ground and then haul away all of that broken material, and then they'd have to pour in new foundation walls and new forms, and hopefully reinforce those walls with rebar and that kind of thing. So it's not uncommon. This can happen with the buckling of the walls and everything. So it'd have to be smoothed out and pour everything in new. And that's why we don't allow them in the floodplain. We don't want to pay out basement busters. That's a good name. But yeah, we don't want to have to pay out insurance claims on non-compliant construction, and just why it's not a good idea to have basements in the floodplain. Manufactured homes are another issue that come up quite often, and since they are quite different from traditional stick frame traditional building, it has its own set of regulations, and so we definitely have to make sure that they are secured by anchors of some kind. So there's over the top ties, or it's attached to piers or piles like it looks like in this diagram. So on the right side, it shows you the proper way that this is done. It's cement blocks that are cemented together, and then it's reinforced with these metal dowels, and there's a concrete footing underneath that. So, and on the other side, there's engineered ground anchors, whatever the case may be, it has to be properly anchored. And so we do have protecting manufactured homes FEMA publication for floodplains that's really helpful if this is an issue. And then they have their utilities elevated on a platform and properly anchored to that on the outside as well. So here's a good example of a manufactured home that has been elevated. It's on these posts or piers. And so one other thing to consider is that the foundation of this construction is actually attached to those posts or piers, because we have seen even where a more traditionally built house was just resting on posts or piers like this, and then the floodwater came in and it can just float away. So even though it's elevated, it has to be attached to that. And so this one's done properly. It's properly permitted and elevated. And so it looks pretty nice. They just need some kind of stairway to be able to access that building. And then here is a bad example. So this is actually in a floodway and it was found during an audit. And so it's just sitting on dry stacked cinder blocks. They are not reinforced. They're not cemented together. This is not elevated high enough. So yeah, there's quite a bit of issues here. It didn't have a no rise certificate at all. So this is, the type of violation issue that we don't want to see, especially in the floodway, because of what can happen. Here's an example of what could happen if that manufactured home was, flooded. It wasn't attached to anything, it's just on blocks. And so it can easily just float away. And anything that enters the flood water becomes debris, and it can cause even additional damage to other structures as it comes into contact with them. So this was some years ago. This manufactured home park was flooded, and it was actually near an oxbow lake. So it was very close to the stream in an area that used to be the stream. And so this manufactured home was not elevated. It just floated away. It floated over to this tree line and was pushed up against the tree line and then snapped in half just completely. So it's, usually if a manufactured home is flooded above that first floor, we can count the first floor to be 100% damaged. Like I said, it doesn't stand up to flooding as well as traditional construction, and there's often materials that aren't as resistant to flood damage. A lot of it is, yes, this is in Manhattan along Wildcat Creek. And so that floor gets damaged, and the particle board, if there's particle board in there, it just becomes flimsy. It falls apart completely when it gets wet. So that's why the materials don't stand up as well. So they just fall apart. And so it's a lot more likely for a manufactured home to be substantially damaged if it's flooded, especially in this case where it's completely snapped in half. We don't have to go through the entire assessment process for this structure. We can just count it 100% damaged. And so yes, definitely substantially damaged here. Okay, so a little bit more about crawl spaces and flood openings in general. So the rule is that we have at least 2 flood openings on different sides. They don't have to be opposite sides, just at least any 2 sides, and then no more than 1 foot above grade. And it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So we need 1 square inch of opening per every 1 square foot of enclosed space. So as long as we meet that threshold, it's properly vented. And again, the interior ground level is at or above the outside grade. It shouldn't be below, because again, that would technically make it a basement. And like I said, we saw people put fill around the crawl space and then accidentally make a basement. And so that was a retrofit project that went wrong. So if they had talked to us, we could have helped prevent something like that from happening. So again, we are always here for any flood issues, any violations or concerns about construction in the floodplain. Just let us know. We're happy to help. And so underfloor utilities, including the ductwork, must be above the base flood elevation. So we would see a lot of houses that got elevated and then they would leave the ductwork just under the floor and not elevate it, and then it was down in the floodplain where it could get flooded. So we don't want to see that. It needs to be elevated as well. So in 2007, much like 2019, I believe, there was just widespread flooding all over the state. And so in one community where it was flooded, there was a company that was coming out and offering to clean and repair ductwork. And they ended up using a steamer to try to accomplish that. And so when steam is hitting the metal of the ductwork, it's just creating condensation. So we're just introducing additional moisture to an area that was just flooded. And so basically they're promoting the growth of mold, and people are just paying them to put mold in their ductwork. And so there are a lot of problems with that. We don't want to breathe in mold. It's not good to be around mold, but it can also cause structural damage as it spreads to other parts of the structure. So that's not good. And so after a disaster, it's important that I'm going to talk more about substantial damage and disaster recovery. I did mention I did that class on post flood responsibility recently. If you want to know more, but letting people know about contractors that might come out and be unscrupulous and try to offer people special deals on getting things repaired, and because people want to recover so quickly that they're not doing things properly. So making sure they are vetted or licensed in your community, or in some way a vetted business that was existing before this disaster happened, because we don't want to see these fly-by-night contractors that come out and make things worse and rip people off after a disaster. And yeah, making mold problems worse, because flood and molds just go together. So here's a good example of flood openings and also a house that is elevated on a full story enclosure. So this is a diagram 7, where we have the enclosure underneath that's used for parking, storage, or building access. And then the utilities are elevated, so you can see they are up to the first elevated floor. And I will talk a little bit more about the machinery and equipment discount, or we did talk about it. So for the diagram 7, it has to be to the lowest elevated floor or higher. So they get that 5% off. Adequate flood openings, and then you can see the high water line on this building. So this is actually from Missouri, I believe. And so this house was inundated for something like 2 months, and then the property owners were able to come back and then just do minor cleaning and repair on things, and or not even really repair, just like cleaning. And this house took no damage. So that's how this works, that the enclosure is used properly, and then the living space is protected, and no one has any flood losses. So that's how it works, and it's successful. And here's another example. So this is a crawl space building. And so you can see the flood vents and how they kind of match the rest of the trim of the house. So what happened was they got an elevation certificate and they got an approved permit, and everything was fine. And then someone from the city eventually noticed what the flood vents looked like. And so they went back to the elevation certificate and looked at the photos, and they didn't match up. So at the time that the elevation certificate was done, the flood openings were fully opened. There was no problem with them. And now the property owner has come back and covered them up with wood coverings. And this happens commonly. But having that documentation on hand, we know that the floodplain administrator or the surveyor, neither of them are at fault. This is something the property owner did. And so you have that to protect you, that documentation. But so they had to send a violation letter to this property owner and let them know that this is a violation. We have to have those flood vents opened. And so people try to cover them up frequently because they don't want animals getting in or something, or I think it makes the floors colder in the winter. But honestly, having collapsed foundation walls is a much bigger problem than just having raccoons in the enclosure. So it's common. Here's another example where people have covered up or boarded over the openings. Another example. And so people who do have this issue that don't want flood openings in their enclosure, there are other options that we have. There are non-engineered openings. So these are like regular coverings that you can find at a hardware store, vents or louvres or screening of some sort that can fit over the opening. That will work as long as we account for the net area of opening that is covered up by that covering. There's also engineered openings that are certified and rated for a particular net opening, and so that can help. It can also help avoid a retrofit if someone doesn't have enough flood openings built into their enclosure. Engineered openings can often have larger, bigger net openings that they're rated for, so that can help cover that problem. They also open and close automatically when flood water rises or falls. So there's no human intervention allowed with the flood opening covers. And so with the non-engineered openings, if you do have those slats that open and close on it, it has to be permanently disabled in the open position to count for the flood opening credit net opening. So here's an example of what can happen if we don't have flood openings. So this is masonry construction, and it's typically stronger than stick frame builds, and people actually are going to get a discount under risk rating 2.0 for having masonry construction. That still doesn't mean it's not still vulnerable to hydrostatic pressures that can collapse the walls. And again, that's much more expensive and troubling to try to fix than to just pay for engineered openings. They're not that much more expensive, and they work great. So this was in Mulvane in 2016. So our team was there the night before for a conference, and then after that it flooded. The downtown area flooded, and then so this is the result of that. And so that's why we have to require openings for an enclosure. So the flood opening information on the elevation certificate goes into section A8, and we have this really handy non-engineered opening guide. And so I can get you an electronic copy of this. We're not able to get any more hard copies, unfortunately, because these are really nice to just hand out to people, but maybe you could print it off or something. But so this goes over the different types of non-engineered openings, like I talked about, like just the regular vent coverings that you can buy at the hardware store that are not engineered or certified, but it helps to tell you exactly how much net opening is still left over after they use a particular type of covering. So this can help you figure that out. And it's nice because there's lots of pictures in here. So yeah, you can just search for that online, or I could send it to you. Oh yeah, and Mulvane had other issues during that flash flood. Oh yeah, the ammonia tanks that washed up under the railroad bridge, and then it created a dam, and they thought it was going to explode. And yeah, and it backed up water all over town. So more about the crawl spaces. Again, we're covering this. They are common, and we need to make sure that they're compliant. So we have the flood opening is within 12 inches of the exterior grade. The interior grade is not below that. And then we have the ductwork 1 foot above the BFE, and especially for CRS communities. If you're thinking about the CRS program, we definitely need to make sure that your ductwork is going to be elevated, and then the lowest floor elevation is there just above the base flood elevation. And again, we have talked a bit about utility systems, and so the middle one, we have it elevated and anchored. The one on the left is elevated, but it's not anchored. And then the one on the right, so these are some kind of fuel tank or propane tank considered utility. So that one is not elevated, it is anchored. So here is an example of something that it looks like. So the propane tank here is not anchored. It's just sitting on blocks, and so this is not the way to do it. If it was flooded and inundated, then it's possible that fuel could leak out. And so we need them to be properly protected and elevated. We have protection of utilities, the FEMA publication that we can send out. And it goes over pretty much every type of utility that you could possibly encounter. And it has lots of pictures and diagrams, so it's really helpful. It talks about wastewater and fuel tanks and think there's a separate publication for fuel tanks as well. And then there's electricity and all of that. So we just want to make sure that this is done the right way. So I have a couple of good examples. I think some of these are from Lawrence. So we have an elevated solar panel, the elevated utilities on these platforms just outside for the HVAC equipment. And I did show you that one full story enclosure that had their utilities elevated. So this is what we want to see. And this is what we don't want to see. So FEMA, I did mention, was paying out a lot of claims on just having utilities that were left on the ground and flooded while the house was elevated. So it doesn't really make sense to have that happen. So on this one, you can see the debris line where it came up to and inundated and then just completely ruined utilities like this. So that's why we don't want to see that. Now, why FEMA changed the rules about elevating utilities. And then, so we looked at this a little bit earlier, the same drawing. And so this wet flood-proofed attached garage, and then these utilities are up on a platform. And I mentioned how under the old system, if these were left on the floor of the garage, it could have changed the rating floor for those property owners. And that is not the case anymore. So this is one of the bigger, or just one of the changes under risk rating 2.0. So these are under mitigation credits. There are 3 different types of mitigation credits. You have machinery and equipment, which is a flat 5% rate. You have proper flood openings in the appropriate foundations that have the enclosure where we can wet flood proof it. That's a between 3 and 27% discount depending on your particular situation in that house or that structure. And then there's one for the type of foundation that you have. I think maybe like a diagram 5 or the more elevated and open non-obstruction type of foundation you have, you can get a discount, and there are not even numbers on that because of all the different rating variables that go into risk rating 2.0. So again, no one's going to be penalized for not elevating machinery and equipment. It can no longer change your rating floor. Your rating floor is just simply your first floor height, as we talked about before. So for a slab on grade, your machinery equipment has to be elevated to the next higher floor or higher, or if it's a 1-story, then to the attic level. If you have a basement, it's to the floor above the basement or higher. If you have any one of the 3 in the center, the 5, 6, or 7 diagrams, so elevated without an enclosure, with an enclosure, or with the full story enclosure, like the house in Missouri that I showed you, it has to be to the lowest elevated floor or higher. So that's why they would qualify for this 5% discount. If you have a crawl space, it must be to the floor above the crawl space or higher. So for your building coverage, that's your AC unit, furnace, heat pump, and elevator equipment. If it's for contents coverage, then that's your clothes washer and dryer and food freezers. So that's how this is going to work under risk rating 2.0. Again, it's a little bit of a change from having floodplain management and insurance working hand in hand. It's not quite as close. And so there may be changes to the NFIP and regulations. There's talk about changing things, but so far not yet. There's still this disconnect a little bit. So I wanted to touch on dry flood proofing a little bit. And I was talking to Steve about this the other day. We can't really think of many structures in Kansas that have dry flood proofing, and I just wanted to cover it in case it does come up for somebody. And they did just update the technical bulletin 3 on this past year. And so they really expanded this technical bulletin and talking about what's required to get the credit for flood proofing. And Just like certifying the levy, this is a feat of engineering. It's very complicated, and so I'm going to talk about it. I'm not an engineer, but so this is from the perspective of someone that might have to look at these documents and then have a licensed professional look at them as well. So floodproofing is a combination of adjustments and or additions of features to a building that eliminate or reduce the potential for flood damage. So that also applies to wet floodproofing, which we've been talking about quite a bit today. And so aside from that, we're talking about dry floodproofing, which is basically the exact opposite of wet floodproofing. So it's kind of a misnomer to call them both floodproofing, but it applies in a different way. So this is a combination of measures that make a building and the utilities watertight and substantially impermeable to floodwater. So now we're doing everything we can to keep water completely out of the building altogether. And again, this is only for non-residential structures. And we have to make sure that they have the capacity to resist the flood loads. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. And so for this, you would need the finished elevation certificate and the signed and certified floodproofing certificate. And I would definitely recommend requiring the plans that go along with this. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So for an existing building, we have to do a preliminary assessment to see if this method is even appropriate for it. Because again, your other option is to elevate it, and elevating is often the better option. Because again, this is very technical and complicated, and there's a lot that goes into it. And then you could still be flooded if any one part of the system goes wrong, and there's a high chance of that happening. So no substitute for elevation is probably the better option, but we can do this, and now we have guidance for it. So the existing building, we have to understand its vulnerability and its performance under flooding conditions. So that means its architectural and structural systems have to be assessed. The building envelope and the type of utility systems, whether they can be relocated or if we can replace it with systems that are designed to be submerged and then work with just minimal cleaning and repair. That's an option. One other thing is determining if this building can also withstand, along with the flooding, the implementations that we're going to put on to actually floodproof it. So that in itself can add strain to the building. And so the flood warning time, if we're going to have active measures, which means we have people coming in and deploying floodproofing measures during that, we have to have enough time to get them in there, do that, and then evacuate safely. We have functional use requirements. How long can this business sit without being used because it's underwater and it's in the floodproofing state? So we can't really use it. Safety and access before, during, and after the flood. And so we have to consider this before we can even decide if we're going to design a floodproofing system. So the design has to comply with our local and state regulations. We have to reduce the damage up to the protection level. We have to have safe and responsible and just feasible active measures if we're going to use active measures and have people go out and deploy them. And then maintenance and operations plans. So I'll talk about that, but those are the two required plans that you need. And then even after all of this, there's that residual risk, and the owner has to understand that risk and be okay with it, and then decide what the benefits versus the risk are of doing a floodproofing system, and then how much of that can be offset by their insurance. So again, active measure, we need people to deploy them. Passive measures, we don't need people to go out and do them. They're just going to work automatically. So there are some floodgates that rise up with floodwater that close automatically. There's reinforced glass called aquarium glass that you can put on windows. That's a passive measure. So again, with the flood warning time and having enough time for someone to go out and do all that. So here are some examples of the floodproofing measures that we can put on the building to try and make it watertight. So that's special windows and doors. Reinforce the buildings because we have to find the seepage areas and areas of entry where water could get into the building, and then do our best to seal those off with gaskets and membranes. And so there's a ton of products out there on the market now to try and accomplish just this. There's sump pumps, self-priming pumps, and so having sump pumps are part of the required design because you're pretty much always going to have some kind of unidentified area of seepage, and so it's virtually impossible, I might say, to actually try to keep it watertight, but we can keep it from causing too much flood damage. And then you have backflow and shutoff valves, which I talked about, which can be used on residential structures as well, flood shields, and then you have to have backup power as well in case you lose power during the flood. That's common. And then, reinforced windows. And so all of that's going to be very site specific and what's appropriate to that particular building and its flooding conditions. And then, so I have mentioned the flood warning time quite a bit. We have to have time to recognize the threat and then notify our personnel to go out there and deploy the stuff, get out there, locate all of that, install it, which may require heavy equipment and detailed instructions, and then evacuate them on some predetermined route, and then that could have closures on it. So you can see how technical and complicating it's getting already, and we haven't even really started the full design process. And so you can find this in the CFR. It's in our ordinances that you have this option, and it clarifies that our higher standards are going to take precedence. Substantial improvement and damage requirements still apply to this. Floodproofing can be very expensive, so that could definitely count as an improvement. And then freeboard requirements, again, 1 foot here of freeboard statewide. And then you have to have 1 foot of freeboard protection level if you want the floodproofing credit for the flood insurance. Otherwise, it could be really expensive if you didn't do that. And so in the new technical bulletin, they clarify that you have to have a design that complies with the ACE 24 and ACE 7 publications. So ACE is the American Society for Civil Engineers, and they have published this, and it works in hand with the International Building Code, or the IBC. And so they have this comparison of how it compares to the NFIP, and it's quite strict. It's generally exceeds the NFIP requirements. So the definition and the documentation, as in the floodproofing certificate, are the same. Everything else is pretty much exceeding in flood hazard area requirements, like the velocities and all the different flood loads have to be a certain level, otherwise you can't do it. The elevation requirement, they have like design floods, and you have to determine what your flood class is, so that's more strict than the NFIP. And then just floodproofing design requirements in general have to meet the standard, and that exceeds it as well. So it's more specific than the NFIP. For example, you have to determine the soil or the fill that's adjacent to the structure. It has to be compacted and protected from erosion and scour. They limit how many active measurements you can put in. There's a requirement for an emergency escape access above your design level. So it gets a little crazy. There's the 2 required plans. So emergency operations for your active measures, and then inspection and maintenance plan as well. So basically on the East Coast, after they had quite a few larger storms, hurricane systems that came through, a lot of these dry floodproofing systems had failed. And so that is why FEMA changed their requirements and really beefed up the language, and they took on the ACE 24 and ACE 7 and all of that. And then it was some years before they even updated this technical bulletin that they added in the required plans that have to be part of it. So yeah, they are really trying to make sure that floodproofing systems don't fail, but it's very difficult, as you can see. any mistake along the way in this technical process could cause the entire building to be flooded anyways. And so you have to have these plans for insurance. You have to submit them. FEMA is going to determine your eligibility for the insurance credits. And then you as a floodplain administrator should also require these plans if someone was going to try to dry floodproof something, so that you can be sure, have someone review it to make sure it's all feasible and good to go. Sometimes communities even have a third party review the plans and make sure that they look good. So I don't need to go through this entire list for you to see how complicated an emergency operations plan has to be. These are the requirements for that plan. So have the personnel with the chain of command, and then notification procedures, and then a decision tree for the installation, and then they're going to have to be drilled and trained on all these different measures, on how to deploy them, and give them the instructions for the power source and all that heavy equipment that they might need to deploy this and everything. So it's really crazy, complicated, and very technical for that personnel that's going to have to be prepared at any time during a flooding condition to come out and do this. So there's that. And then the inspection and maintenance plan. So this is where we inspect and maintain all of our floodproofing products when we're not flooding, so that we can make sure that they are there and that they work when there is a flood. So this again is pretty technical and complicated, and Steve has told me about some buildings that had these floodproofing systems, like flood shields, or those panels that fit over windows or doors. And they were hidden under boxes and they couldn't find them. So they didn't have a plan here that says specifically where they're stored and how they should be stored. Or when they found them, they had been bent over time because they had stuff sitting on them, so they didn't fit when there was actually a flood coming. So that is, again, one of the places where these systems were failing, and why FEMA now requires all of this extra documentation of how you're going to do all of this. So they also have a design flow chart. So after all of that, then you can start your actual design. And so I kind of like these flow charts that just show us what all we need to do. And if you have to go back and do something again, eventually they certify the design, and they get the flood insurance and the permits and everything. So yeah, it's very technical, and of course, like I said, any hiccup along the way here could cause you to have a flooded building. So that's more than likely why we don't see these very much in Kansas. It's a big undertaking, and you'd have to be very, very committed to having a dry floodproofing system. And so FEMA in the technical bulletin included a lot of information about what they've learned, their lessons learned about why systems may have failed. And so some of it is that we have, those lack of plans where people don't know where stuff is kept, or it's been damaged in the off time when there wasn't flooding. There wasn't good enough details. People aren't maintaining them because of deficiencies in that plan. And then we have seen systems where a new owner takes over and then nobody ever tells them that there's a floodproofing system or how it works. And so when there's flooding, they have no idea about the floodproofing system and how it's supposed to work. Of course, poor maintenance on gaskets and those other products that are supposed to be maintained. Contractors will sometimes be called out to fix something, and then they have no idea that they're actually modifying some of the floodproofing system, like the mounts on a door or window for those shields. And then you have unidentified areas of seepage. You have people not deploying something correctly, or whatever the case may be. The system is very complicated and very delicate. So then you could just still have, after all this work and all this money, have a failure, and your building's full of floodwater. So more than likely why we don't see this very much, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of taste of the technicalities that are now required for a dry floodproofing system and what you might be looking for when you're reviewing something like that, should it come up. And then I have mentioned this a couple times throughout the morning. The residential basement exemption program. So before we can permit any residential basements, we have to be a part of this program. And as I mentioned, we only have 10 communities in Kansas that are part of this program. But if you want to learn any more about floodproofing, next week I'm doing a floodproofing class where I'll be talking about this and dry and wet and the 2 certificates. You know, if you haven't gotten enough this morning, that's next Monday. But so you get into this program, FEMA approves you, and then you have these specific standards that you have to build a basement to. And so this also gets put into your ordinance about how basements are constructed. So they are floodproofed to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And that's 2 feet if the difference between that and the 500 or moderate flood risk area is greater than 3 feet. And that means the floor of the basement is no lower than 5 feet below the base flood elevation. So oftentimes what you end up with is just a sort of sunken living room type of structure. It doesn't look like a traditional basement because it can't be as deep because of the base flood elevation. And so you have that, and then constructed with adequate fill that surrounds the building. And so that's part of the construction requirements, and then certified by an architect or an engineer. So like I mentioned, an architect can do floodproofing, but not elevation certificates. And so again, we are looking for dry floodproofing, of course, not with you know, all that technical dry floodproofing full system, just watertight basement with walls that are impermeable to the passage of water. And so I've been looking more into construction techniques for this, and it's really about reinforcing the walls and finding different ways to reinforce the walls and the floor and everything. So it is still pretty technical and a big commitment to try to build a basement in the floodplain. And it just seems like there are better foundation options because of course floodproofing can fail no matter what, but we have to build it to withstand the hydrostatic and dynamic pressures, including the buoyancy that pushes up on the bottom. So we talked about regular basements, it's the same thing. So we do have that fill surrounding the area that should be protecting from these different flood forces that are trying to act on it. And then designed for minimum damage. And so we have had cases where this has failed, and one in particular where a basement under construction was actually flooded, but then it was actually saved by having water washing under the footing. So that's something that can happen. So this is the actual floodproofing certificate for the residential basement. And so this is different. This is a different document than the floodproofing certificate for the full-on dry floodproofing system for non-residential buildings. And so we had an architect who was doing one of these residential basements, and the community wasn't even in the program. So that was the problem to begin with. These the instructions for this document now say that. So I'm thinking that may have been on an older form. So this current form expires in July of 2024. So I'll show you the instructions. They're very short at the end of this document, but it says that the community has to be in this program for this to be compliant and allowed. So not only were they not in the program, the architect used the non-residential floodproofing certificate to put in the basement. And so the floodplain administrator, who was an engineer, didn't know this somehow. And so it ended up being accepted. And then because he was following the non-residential form, he wasn't following the actual residential requirements. And so that basement was 6 feet below ground and 8 feet below the base flood elevation. So that's a whole can of worms that would have to be, fixed. And so I think that's another reason why FEMA has really clarified and put a lot more detail into these types of certificate documents, and like the letter of map change applications, and the elevation certificate has a long list of instructions just to help avoid any mistakes. Yeah, but the instructions don't help if you don't read them. So yes, read the instructions and definitely review everything before you sign off on it. And don't just trust the engineer or the land surveyor's word. We work with some really great professionals out here, but we have to double check everything. And so yeah, there we go. So the first part here is just property information. The land description, or the legal description, city, state, and zip code. So all this information, the address should be matching on anywhere where it asks for that. So section 2 is asking for the flood-proofed elevation information. So this is very much like an elevation certificate, but it's specific to this basement. So the level of floodproofing elevation, and then the top of the basement floor elevation, and then the highest adjacent grade and lowest adjacent grade are on here documented. Of course, it should be in feet, not meters. It's only for Puerto Rico. And then make sure that the datums match up. And that goes for elevation certificates too. Make sure that the datums are in the same, style as the, make sure the datums match up with the firm and everything. And then they sign and certify this with their information, and they put their seal on it. And then the last part here is section 3. And so if you'll notice under that first paragraph, it says ACE 24. So ACE 24 again is used for the floodproofing standards here. You are certifying that it does comply with those regulations, and that it's watertight and it's going to resist the flood loads, and that it complies with the requirements, and the fill is not going to erode. So then they sign and seal that. And the last part here, it's a very short set of instructions, but it says communities have been specifically approved and authorized to have residential basement floodproofing. So it's a pretty short form in comparison to some of the others, but it's still pretty technical. And then floodproof basements and the flood insurance discount. So to be eligible for this discount for the residential basements, it's you're in that participating program, and then you're in the special flood hazard areas. And then non-residential buildings, I mentioned that you can't dry floodproof in a V zone. Of course, we don't have any in Kansas, so we don't have to worry about V zones ever here. And then in any participating NFIP community. And so FEMA will determine that eligibility on a case-by-case basis. And this is going to continue with risk grading 2.0 because I have been asking for a little bit more information from others and from FEMA themselves just about how this is going to go with phase 2 of risk grading 2.0 coming out in April, so April 1st. So they're going to pay the full premium and then submit the documentation and the application to the agent, and then FEMA is going to review all of that and their eligibility criteria and the construction and everything, and then they work through the insurance carrier to apply that discount. So that's how it's going to work. We just don't know how it's going to impact the premiums until people start to renew under phase 2. And again, we don't have a lot of these structures to begin with. And so some of these participating communities are going to become ineligible, or some of their policyholders will become ineligible because of changes in their risk. So if a community withdraws from the program, then those who had already been receiving the discount will keep it because nothing about their risk has changed. So those in a community that altogether no longer qualifies are not going to get the discount because their risk has changed, and they're going to start on that glide path to their full risk rate at the time of renewal. So that is going to be interesting to watch when that happens. And then policyholders that are in a community where some become ineligible because risk in their area has changed. So those policyholders will not be eligible, and they are going to go on the glide path to their full risk rate, and then policyholders that are still eligible can keep it. So there's that. And then accessory structures are something that come up very frequently in the floodplain. This is something we deal with all the time. Again, in the audits. So this is like a shed for tools or a riding lawnmower or something. A single car garage is similar. So it might be nice to have a printout like this to give to people when they ask for a permit on an accessory structure, to make sure that they understand the requirements of being wet flood proofed and having elevated utilities used only for storage or parking. And that use cannot be modified later on. There's no habitability, no entertainment purposes, no manufacturing or retail or anything like that. I've tried to see people get away with calling something like that an accessory structure that doesn't meet the use requirements. And so it has to be no larger than 600 square feet. That is FEMA's definition of a low cost investment. And then here's a good example of one. It's elevated, the utilities are elevated, so it looks good as long as we have an elevation certificate for this to make sure that it's elevated properly, then it is good to go. Here's a bad example of that. Not flood proofed, it's not, there's no flood openings, not flood damage resistant materials, and it's not elevated or anchored at all. If you see this, it's just on wood. So I think that is something that could also be a code violation, as is this. It has the same issues, no openings or elevation, definitely not the right materials. And yeah, this is just a problem. Agricultural structures are similar to them. So we are working with Technical Bulletin 7. FEMA also released a couple of publications last year that helped to clarify this. But these are similar. So the use is in connection with production, harvesting, storage, drying, or raising of agricultural commodities. But we don't want to see livestock confinement buildings. Otherwise, we're looking more at the produce side of agriculture. But yes, pole frame buildings, steel grain, that kind of thing is more what we're looking at. But again, no employment or entertainment purposes. And then it can be wet flood proofed. So here's a good example. There's no size limitation on agricultural buildings, so it is different from a accessory building in that way, but you can see the openings, and it's flood proof materials, and it's properly anchored and everything. So this is a better example. So here's the policy. It's supposed to clarify more on the granting of this type of variance. Is a different type of variance than what you would normally think of when I talked about variances earlier. These are specifically for agricultural and accessory buildings. And so basically, this is what it looks like. It could be wet or dry flood proofed. It has to be permitted, and there's no disaster assistance, and it has to be done correctly. Otherwise, it's not going to be eligible for flood insurance, and it has to meet those use requirements. And so we're looking at two car garages, carports, those sheds, not so much a gazebo or a pavilion or a picnic shelter or something like that. So you have to request a variance. You can get a community-wide exception for this. So you have to prove exceptional hardship for this variance still, but it's easier and more feasible than a regular variance. So there's that policy, and then there's this publication that was released. This is much longer, and it talks more about all the definitions. It has more examples, specific construction standards, wet flood proofing, and combining different types of flood proofing, and what type of ag structures are low damage potential versus the ones that are high damage potential, health, safety, and welfare. So if you want to see this, let me know. It can help. It has model ordinance language in there, and we have model ordinance language too for permitting these two types of structures. Sorry, I rushed through that a little bit, and I am again going over time. I'm so sorry, guys. So I will stop sharing my screen and launch our poll question, our third one. So then after this, we'll take a break and then I'll finish up our class. So here is the third question. I'm going to launch it. Again, I need you to answer this if you want credits. What is a LOMA, or a letter of map amendment, based on fill above the base flood elevation, shown as out of the floodplain, a full revision and republishing to map panels, or a full revision to the firm, or on natural grade above the base flood elevation. So I will give you guys another 30 seconds or so to go ahead and answer that. If you want credit, let me know. Or sorry, if you want credit, go ahead and answer this. Give you a couple more seconds, 5 more seconds. Okay. Okay. And yeah, there were 2 correct answers on this. It was a trick question. I actually thought I fixed this when I sent it to Tara, but yes, it's either out as shown or it's based on natural grade above the BFE. Either one of those is a correct answer for the LOMA, and I apologize for that. Not trying to trick you guys, but I'm glad that you know that it could be either one, so that's fine. Oh, I didn't share the results. Wait, yeah, I did. Anyways, yep, there's the results. So I'm going to pause the recording and share my screen. Okay. So just a few more slides and then one more poll question and we'll be done. So what is wrong here? This is a building that was in Lyon County, and so I just don't even know where to start with this. I guess it's supposed to be a non-residential building. It's clearly not built in compliance. It's not wet flood proofed or elevated. If it's supposed to be an agricultural building, because it turns out there were, I guess, cockfights going out in behind this building, and it's kind of in a horseshoe shape. And then, so you can see some birds out front. Okay, yeah, they tried to call it an agricultural building. It's clearly not wet flood proofed or anchored or made of the flood damage resistant material. And so it could be a code enforcement issue. We're concerned with the flood issues here. And so, yeah, this is another bad example that we don't want to see. And of course, the use requirements for agricultural buildings have to be remembered. This along with recreational vehicles. So we do have separate standards for these in our ordinances, that they have to be on site for fewer than 180 days and be fully licensed and ready for highway use. So if it's more than 180 days, it might not be able to be moved, you know, if it's just been sitting there for a while. And so these come up quite often during our audits. I find people with RVs all the time, which is fine as long as they are adhering to the regulations for RVs in the floodplain. So being licensed and ready for highway use means it does have a license on it, and it's the license plate, and it has air in the tires. And so it's not sitting up on cinder blocks or something. It definitely looks self-propelled. And so, we don't make them go out and start the engine. We just have the floodplain administrator go and look at it, do the inspection, and make sure that it's compliant with that. So usually you can just tell by looking at it that it's more or less ready for highway use. And so that also means connected to the site only by the quick disconnect type of utilities. So it's not a permanent setup with the utilities that looks more like a structure and there's no additions being built onto it or something like that. That would be different. And so Steve did tell me about an RV park. So we've had several RV parks in the floodplain and making sure that they're compliant. And then that RV park owner would have an RV parade every 180 days. So everyone would drive their RV around to make sure that they were compliant with that 180-day requirement, which is actually fine. It's a good idea. It kind of proves that they are actually highway ready, that they can drive and they're self-propelled and there's air in the tires. And so RV parks do pose a problem sometimes in the floodplain, especially in a flash flood or something where people haven't checked the weather and then they end up in a situation like this where they have to be rescued. And again, people getting trapped in vehicles is dangerous, and so we wouldn't want them to get trapped in an RV either. And so what do pre and post firm mean? So I have mentioned this a little bit. So it's pre-firm if it was built on or before December 31st, 1974. So if you think back to the early 70s and all those changes in laws, this was part of that. So you either have that as a pre-firm date or you have the date of your first effective firm. So if that's later, then it's whichever is later. So anything built after that date is going to be post-firm. So we do have some pre-firm buildings here in Kansas that were built even before 1968, so quite a bit older. And many of them do have basements because at the time people were more worried about tornado protection than they were about, flooding damage. And so a post-firm should be elevated, theoretically, depending on when it was built and the map changes that have happened in between that time. Post-firm buildings are built after we have the scientific data and flood risk information. So we have a better understanding with our base flood elevation, and sometimes that goes up. So houses are still not elevated high enough. Sometimes even the pre-firm houses are elevated, but not quite high enough and not above the base flood elevation. So they are often more flood prone than the post-firm. And so again, it ties back to the mandatory purchase requirements and the changes in laws in the early 70s. And so there used to be different types of flood insurance policies for pre and post firm until risk rating 2.0. And now being pre or post firm is just one of the considerations, one of your variables that goes into your premium. So it's changed a bit since then. But here's a pre-firm here in Kansas that was flooded. Again, doesn't look very elevated. Many of them are not elevated. And so we have to consider substantial improvement when people do change things about their houses, especially if they're pre-firm. We have to account for depreciation. So houses that are a bit older don't have as much of a market value after that. And it's good to be aware, as Steve has mentioned in the chat, to be aware of the permitting situations. So I have the substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference and a bit about that in here that talks about how we can determine what kind of compliance is required based on whether it's substantial improvement and whether it's a pre or post firm building. So having the market value is something we're going to need, and also knowing the construction date for that building and what the pre-firm date cutoff is for your community. So here in this example, we have a market value of $110,000, and then they decide to go ahead and make improvements for a cost of $68,500. And so they are equal to or greater than the 50% threshold. So that's the rule for substantial improvement and substantial damage, which are really one and the same. They're two sides of the same coin. So if you're equal to or greater than 50%, then you have hit that threshold. And so for $110,000, that would be a $55,000 improvement right at the 50% mark. So we are over that. And you can see that this house has been elevated on a crawl space, and it has the flood openings that are drawn in addition to this whole addition that has gone on with the second floor. So there's a vertical addition involved here, and there's a deck. And so after that, it ends up being a total building value of $178,500. So that's the basic outline of how we are looking at improvements. So here's a substantially improved manufactured homes. And so many manufactured homes are not worth as much as traditional frame buildings, and especially as they get older. Again, we are accounting for depreciation over time. So if it's a manufactured home that was built decades and decades ago, then there's a possibility that this structure could only be worth maybe $500 or something. And so if you build on a room addition as they've done here, it looks like it's not finished yet. If it's more than $250 for materials and labor, then they're going to hit that threshold. And this one happens to be structurally connected, which makes a difference. And I will show you that chart in a couple of slides. But we have to account for materials and labor, even if those things have been donated. So there are lots of charity groups that go around and provide free labor and materials to people. We still have to count it as if they are hiring a licensed contractor. So we have to multiply that cost by the hour. So that can't be exempt. And then, so we would need an elevation certificate to tell us that it's 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit too low, and it's a substantial improvement. So I have another example here of a pre-firm, excuse me, manufactured home where they have put on a lateral addition that's not a substantial improvement, and it's not structurally connected. So check this out. There's no door inside that connects this lateral addition to the rest of the structure, so that makes a difference. Not sure about this one being made of flood damage resistant materials. It looks like it might not be, but the point is it's not structurally connected, and it's not a substantial improvement. It's kind of just leaned up against this, and it's not actually worth 50% or more of the market value. So here's the decision table that I've been talking about. So if you don't have this desk reference, you should definitely download it or let me send it to you, because it goes through all of these scenarios that you're likely to see of substantial improvement or any kind of improvement. So you have rehabilitation, lateral additions, vertical additions, repair. So it does also talk about substantial damage in here. Again, they're one and the same. And if you have 2 of them occurring within your 1-year time frame, or if you have cumulative improvement, then your 5 or 10-year time frame, then we have to add them together. So on here we can see a lateral addition that is substantially improved and structurally connected. So that would be our first example. And that addition is required to comply, and the building is required to comply. So this is really good to help us evaluate permits when we're determining whether it's substantial improvement or substantial damage, to have this and know what the compliance requirements are, because this was really hard for me to understand at first. So if you're just starting out in floodplain management, this is definitely a go-to publication to have. So the one that's not structurally connected and not a substantial improvement, the addition doesn't have to comply. So it's good to know these things and have this on hand. And again, so if someone's doing an improvement that's not a substantial improvement, we should still be encouraging them to take on these additional measures. So hopefully you're having a conversation, you're having a working relationship with this applicant, and you can encourage them, oh, if you're improving this, consider elevating your utilities and those electrical outlets, your air conditioning equipment. Try vinyl or tile, because you're in the floodplain, so we should be doing everything we can to help you protect your investment. And again, because you're adding money to that investment, so we should keep it safe from flood damage. And of course, flood insurance is always a go-to encouragement. Definitely encourage everyone to get flood insurance. I know it can be difficult, and risk rating 2.0 is kind of changing that a bit. So, we do what we can to encourage people. The ductwork out of crawl spaces, adding in those flood openings to the crawl space, anything we can do to eliminate damage. Definitely the backflow valve. I think that's probably a pretty easy sell to make sure that that doesn't get backed up. So permits, again, we have to verify this, the cost of improvement. So I do have this as part of that template permit. So if you don't have this, it really, I think, should be part of your floodplain development permit so that we can evaluate the costs and then just have it as part of the permitting process itself to determine whether it's substantial improvement. I guess you could be doing it separately off the permit, but that way it's better documented. Yeah, so definitely talk about flood insurance, but yes, the market value. So for one thing, we have property assessment records. So there's usually the county appraiser websites that are available online and to everyone. It's public information that everyone knows about and is familiar with. So when you pay property taxes, you have that information from the appraiser about the market value that you have. And so if you don't petition that, or if you don't appeal that value, then you basically accepted that that's your market value. And so then we can compare the cost of the improvements, again, with the labor, with all of the required improvement costs, and then we compare that to the market value, and then that's how we can arrive at our determination on whether this is a substantial improvement or not. And so we have to bring it into compliance, and then the same thing with substantial damage. So and then we're also encouraging them to put in those other non-credited improvements as much as we can, because it's worth protecting your structure. So this is a higher standard that we have. This is from our model ordinance, higher standard optional section. So again, get with me if you want to look at your ordinance or anything, but cumulative improvement is where we extend the typical 1 year period that we would consider for damage and improvement, and we extend it to 5 or 10 years. So that way that we know, all of that work cumulatively together over that period would be 50% or more, then we're hitting that threshold a little bit earlier. But it makes sense, to keep track of this improvement. And the more they put into their investment, the more we should be requiring them to be in compliance with our updated ordinances and bring it, into compliance with a safer standard, since they're putting all of that value into their home. And so there are other optional standards that we have in our ordinance that can help, make your program safer. So bringing it into compliance, of course, means the 1 foot of freeboard or the dry flood proofing if you're a non-residential building. So we have that. And then, of course, damage, I said, is the same thing, basically. So one misconception is that we're just talking about flood. I have seen that quite a bit before. I am talking about damage from any cause: fire, flood, wind, tornadoes, or if I drive my car into your living room. We have to assess whether that's substantial damage or not. And that includes the repair costs of materials and labor, the same way it does with the improvement. So we take that value. The repair costs on this building ends up being 60% because it's $60,000 out of $100,000 market value. And so yes, it is substantially damaged. We write them a determination letter and talk about how they or what they need to do exactly to come into compliance. And of course, that means our 1 foot of freeboard here. So if you don't have this, you should definitely have it. This is our disaster damage assessment package, or a post-disaster assessment package. So it's just a collection of documents and advice and information that we've put together into a little compact document for everyone to have. I send it to people all the time, but it's useful information, and I want everybody to know it, how to deal with a disaster, what exactly you need to do following a disaster, the substantial damage rules, and then definitely talks about how to do substantial damage assessments, how to go out in the field, how to organize things using maps. And then there's also the FEMA substantial damage estimator tool. So we just talk a little bit about that. FEMA has their own classes on that are very good. But the key thing here is to just really be prepared before something happens, because you don't want to lose out on time afterwards, because people are so eager to repair and get things back to normal. And that could mean just building back the way they were. And we need to assess, whether they were substantially damaged and whether they need to come into compliance with our current regulations. So that is something to consider. So we have all this information in a compact document, like I said, and then here's a decision tree that I stole from Nebraska from there, a similar document. I like flowcharts, as you may have noticed, but it's just a very visual way of looking at the process, and it can help you break it down and understand it a little bit better. So is it in the special flood hazard area? If it's not, then we don't care. Yes, we need to assess it and then make that determination. Is it substantially damaged? No, then we just give them a permit. If it is, yes, then we have to figure out exactly what they need to do specifically to come into compliance and get them that substantial determination letter. So again, the desk reference, very helpful, and it works hand in hand with the substantial damage estimator software. So again, improvement damage, basically the same thing. So we have to add them together if they are within our specific time period, which is in general 1 year or more if we've adopted a higher standard. So sometimes people do this together, where they're repairing substantial damage, and then they're like, we always thought about doing a room addition. Why don't we do this now, since we're doing all this work on the house? That gets added together. And again, beware of that eagerness to repair and get back to normal. So you need to be ready to go after a disaster. So this happened in Chapman, the same thing, where they were doing a remodel that ended up being 40% improvement. And then they had a tornado afterwards, and that pushed them over the 50% because their roof got ripped off by that tornado. And so that whole situation turned ugly, because while they were repairing the roof, they had a tarp over it. And then rain happened after the tornado, and then it flooded the house. It got through the tarp, or the tarp fell off, something like that. 5 inches of rain ended up getting into that house after they were damaged. And so it got even worse. And there was a mold issue, and then a lawsuit between the tenant and the landlord over whether they would be paying rent over this time. So that's another concern. After a disaster like this, or any damage to a house, you will be dealing with emotional people that are dealing with a large financial prospect. So that's something else to be prepared for. And this substantial damage estimation software, FEMA has 2 really good classes on this. They are very long, but they're very detailed. So we don't even need to put together our own course here at the state, because FEMA's already done it. And so I definitely recommend going ahead and doing that. If you're a person like me that would probably rather use software than all hard copies, just because that's easier for me, then I would definitely go ahead and download this and get familiar with it and take those couple of classes. And also preemptively making property files for all of your properties that are in the special flood hazard area. That way you can just hit the ground running, you're ready to go. You can establish where the damage has happened in the special flood hazard area and then get on those assessments as soon as possible. Because again, your time is precious after a disaster. Also, some communities make door hangers for when a disaster happens, and it contains publications on, FEMA and, from FEMA about repairing damage or, just compliance in general, and then maybe a permit application and a notice talking about the assessment that you're going to do, and just maybe personally delivering that information to the property owners that have been damaged after a disaster, so they know they need permits and they know you're going to come by and do an assessment, and that if they're substantially damaged, they have to come into compliance. So just giving them all of that information, I think, is a really good idea, because again, people are eager to repair, and if they make repairs before you're able to do the assessment, then they could be building out of compliance if they're substantially damaged, and they need a permit. So it kind of goes both ways there. Anyways, if you take those two classes, you get a certificate, you take a final exam, and again, it's really helpful in doing estimations. And there's also something else for the homes that are damaged by flood damage. So I did say substantial damage from any cause. So if it happens to be flood, there's a separate claim that you can make on a standard flood insurance policy about increased cost of compliance. So yeah, it's a separate claim that you are eligible for up to $30,000 to do some kind of project on your house to get it into compliance, which could mean elevating it or demolishing the house in some cases, or if it's able to be moved, maybe moving the house to a different location. So if it's in the special flood hazard area and they get a determination from you, the floodplain administrator, that it was substantially damaged, then they can make this claim, which is another reason to act quickly after a disaster to make sure that people get these letters on time, because they have a very limited window of time after a disaster to make a claim on this. And flood insurance in general, there's very strict time limits on making claims. So that's, and you are, as the floodplain administrator, responsible for doing these assessments. So you do have to make a determination. And like I said, I have a class that I did just a few weeks ago on this, if you want to see it. And Steve put that in the chat a while back. But so yeah, here's an ICC project. This is before they started construction, but this is just after they got flooded. And then here's during construction. So you can see that they went with the elevation option, and it looks like they're going on a full story enclosure, or at least more than 5 feet. So you can see all the flood openings that they've put in to this large full story enclosure. And then here's the finished product, which actually looks really nice, and it's much safer, and it looks compliant with all the flood opening requirements for an enclosure. And our living floor is not going to be flooded, most likely, at least not by the base flood. So here is just a little sketch of mitigation as far as relocating a structure. So definitely that structure has to be able to withstand being relocated, and not all of them are going to be. But this is what it looks like. It looks kind of crazy seeing a house driving down the road, but then it's relocated to higher ground, hopefully outside of the floodplain altogether, of course. And then this actually wasn't part of an ICC project, but this is basically how the process works. If you have, a new place to be relocated to. And then some of these mitigation projects are just demolition. So we do have the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. So this is a mitigation grant that requires a presidential disaster declaration, but the main focus of this particular grant program, and there are 3 different ones, is to get open space, do these acquisition projects where they buy out these houses that are flooded frequently, and then they just demolish them. And then you hold that particular area in open space in perpetuity. So there's a deed restriction where you cannot build any more structures, you can do like conservation type of projects and that kind of thing. There's compatible uses with that, but it's a permanent mitigation solution, so FEMA likes it. And then I just wanted to touch on violations really quickly. We have spent a bit of time talking about this and how they start to happen, but having a process for dealing with them and understanding that and following that process consistently is important. So I do have a sample letter for this. This is a letter of allegation. So basically we say something's wrong, your structure is in violation for whatever reason. And this can help them understand there's a violation. Sometimes they will fix it before anything even happened, or we have seen a case where a permit was filed incorrectly and there actually was a permit. So this can, as a magic trick, help you resolve a violation before anything happens. Of course, sometimes it doesn't always work out that way and we have to go ahead with more enforcement and difficult procedures, but always be willing to admit that you made a mistake if you are the one that made a mistake. And because these do not get better, if we just ignore them, we have to deal with them. And they usually get worse as we go on if we don't deal with them. But we are here to support you, so just let us know about that. And then one last thing about CRS is a program where you take on more floodplain management activities, and then you get a discount for your citizens on flood insurance. We have 43 participating communities in Kansas. 2 of those are pending applications. So please let me know if you're interested in this program. It's a great program, gives you a safer community, most importantly, but also builds that political goodwill and gives people discounts. So it's great. If you're curious about CFM exams, I have some study material that's also worth CRS points. Being prepared for flood emergencies, having a kit, make sure you're safe, tell your citizens to be safe. Always turn around, don't drown, don't drive into floodwaters. As Steve mentioned earlier in the chat, I could possibly have free signs to give away. We have an ongoing project. So I'd get back with USACE and I'm going to meet with them and talk with them about it. But if you are interested in getting some of these free signs to help warn people to not drive into flood waters, then please let me know. And that's the end of our presentation. I appreciate you being here. I'm so sorry for going over again, but we have other resources, but really if you have other questions, just let me know. I'm happy to get with you on any of these publications or information or anything else that you'd want to know about or discuss. I was going to launch our very last poll question and then we can get out of here. So here's our last poll question. And again, thanks so much for being here. What law is FEMA being sued for? NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, or the Clean Water Act? Sorry, there was supposed to be a 4th option with the executive order 11988, but it ended up next to Clean Water Act. So you have 3 options. I'll give you guys another minute to answer that, and then we'll be done. Okay, I'm gonna give you like another 15 seconds here. Only got like 66% of you, so I need this if you want credit, but otherwise give you 5 more seconds. Okay. And yes, so half of you are right. It is the Endangered Species Act that they are being sued for, and they are, tying up us getting more information and guidance on that. So there is that. Steve, is there anything I need to address in the chat?
No, there's not.
Okay, so yes, if you participated in the questions, please send me an email so I know to send you a completion certificate, and I'm going to stop the recording.